Chapter 6, Part 1 of The Confessions of Arsène Lupin. Recording is in the public domain. The Confessions of Arsène Lupin, by Maurice LeBlanc. Chapter 6. Shadowed by Death. After he had been round the walls of the property, Arsène Lupin returned to the spot from which he started. It was perfectly clear to him that there was no breach in the walls, and the only way of entering the extensive grounds of the Château de Maupertuis was through a little low door, firmly bolted on the inside, or through the principal gate, which was overlooked by the lodge. "Very well," he said, "we must employ heroic methods." Pushing his way into the copsewood where he had hidden his motor bicycle, he unwound a length of twine from under the saddle and went to a place which he had noticed in the course of his exploration. At this place, which was situated far from the road, on the edge of a wood, a number of large trees, standing inside the park, overlapped the wall. Lupin fastened a stone to the end of the string, threw it up and caught a thick branch, which he drew down to him and bestraddled. The branch, in recovering its position, raised him from the ground. He climbed over the wall, slipped down the tree and sprang lightly on the grass. It was winter, and through the leafless boughs, across the undulating lawns, he could see the little Château de Maupertuis in the distance. Fearing lest he should be perceived, he concealed himself behind a clump of fir trees. From there, with the aid of a field glass, he studied the dark and melancholy front of the manor house. All the windows were closed and, as it were, barricaded with solid shutters. The house might easily have been uninhabited. "By Jove!" muttered Lupin. "It's not the liveliest of residences. I shall certainly not come here to end my days." But the clock struck 3. One of the doors on the ground floor opened and the figure of a woman appeared, a very slender figure wrapped in a brown cloak. The woman walked up and down for a few minutes and was at once surrounded by birds, to which she scattered crumbs of bread. Then she went down the stone steps that led to the middle lawn and skirted it, taking the path on the right. With his field glass, Lupin could distinctly see her coming in his direction. She was tall, fair-haired, graceful in appearance, and seemed to be quite a young girl. She walked with a sprightly step, looking at the pale December sun and amusing herself by breaking the little dead twigs on the shrubs along the road. She had gone nearly 2/3 of the distance that separated her from Lupin when there came a furious sound of barking, and a huge dog, a colossal Danish boarhound, sprang from a neighbouring kennel and stood erect at the end of the chain by which it was fastened. The girl moved a little to one side, without paying further attention to what was doubtless a daily incident. The dog grew angrier than ever, standing on its legs and dragging at its collar, at the risk of strangling itself. 30 or 40 steps farther, yielding probably to an impulse of impatience, the girl turned round and made a gesture with her hand. The Great Dane gave a start of rage, retreated to the back of its kennel and rushed out again, this time unfettered. The girl uttered a cry of mad terror. The dog was covering the space between them, trailing its broken chain behind it. She began to run with all her might, and screamed out desperately for help. But the dog came up with her in a few bounds. She fell, at once exhausted, giving herself up for lost. The animal was already upon her, almost touching her. At that exact moment, a shot rang out. The dog turned a complete somersault, recovered its feet, tore the ground and then lay down, giving a number of hoarse, breathless howls, which ended in a dull moan and an indistinct gurgling. And that was all. "Dead," said Lupin, who had hastened up at once, prepared, if necessary, to fire his revolver a second time. The girl had risen and stood pale, still staggering. She looked in great surprise at this man whom she did not know and who had saved her life. And she whispered: "Thank you. I've had a great fright. You were in the nick of time. I thank you, monsieur." Lupin took off his hat. "Allow me to introduce myself, mademoiselle. My name is Paul Daubreuil. But before entering into any explanations, I must ask for one moment." He stooped over the dog's dead body and examined the chain at the part where the brute's effort had snapped it. "That's it," he said between his teeth. "It's just as I suspected. By Jupiter, things are moving rapidly. I ought to have come earlier." Returning to the girl's side, he said to her, speaking very quickly: "Mademoiselle, we have not a minute to lose. My presence in these grounds is quite irregular. I do not wish to be surprised here; and this for reasons that concern yourself alone. Do you think that the report can have been heard at the house?" The girl seemed already to have recovered from her emotion; and she replied, with a calmness that revealed all her pluck: "I don't think so." "Is your father in the house to day?" "My father is ill and has been in bed for months. Besides, his room looks out on the other front." "And the servants?" "Their quarters and the kitchen are also on the other side. No one ever comes to this part. I walk here myself, but nobody else does." "It is probable, therefore, that I have not been seen either, especially as the trees hide us?" "It is most probable." "Then I can speak to you freely?" "Certainly, but I don't understand." "You will, presently. Permit me to be brief. The point is this: 4 days ago, Mademoiselle Jeanne Darcieux—" "That is my name," she said, smiling. "Mademoiselle Jeanne Darcieux," continued Lupin, "wrote a letter to one of her friends, called Marceline, who lives at Versailles." "How do you know all that?" asked the girl, in astonishment. "I tore up the letter before I had finished it." "And you flung the pieces on the edge of the road that runs from the house to Vendôme." "That's true. I'd gone out walking." "The pieces were picked up; and they came into my hands next day." "Then you must have read them," said Jeanne Darcieux, betraying a certain annoyance by her manner. "Yes, I committed that indiscretion; and I do not regret it, because I can save you." "Save me? From what?" "From death." Lupin spoke this little sentence in a very distinct voice. The girl gave a shudder. Then she said: "I am not threatened with death?" "Yes, you are, mademoiselle. At the end of October, you were reading on a bench on the terrace where you were accustomed to sit at the same hour every day, when a block of stone fell from the cornice above your head and you were within a few inches of being crushed." "An accident?" "One fine evening in November, you were walking in the kitchen garden, by moonlight. A shot was fired. The bullet whizzed past your ear." "At least I thought so." "Lastly, less than a week ago, the little wooden bridge that crosses the river in the park, 2 yards from the waterfall, gave way while you were on it. You were just able, by a miracle, to catch hold of the root of a tree." Jeanne Darcieux tried to smile: "Very well. But, as I wrote to Marceline, these are only a series of coincidences, of accidents." "No, mademoiselle, no. One accident of this sort is allowable. So are 2. And even then. But we have no right to suppose that the chapter of accidents, repeating the same act 3 times in such different and extraordinary circumstances, is a mere amusing coincidence. That is why I thought that I might presume to come to your assistance. And as my intervention can be of no use unless it remains secret, I do not hesitate to make my way in here, without walking through the gate. I came in the nick of time, as you said. Your enemy was attacking you once more." "What? Do you think? No, it is impossible. I refuse to believe." Lupin picked up the chain and, showing it to her: "Look at the last link. There is no question but that it has been filed. Otherwise, so powerful a chain as this would never have yielded. Besides, you can see the mark of the file here." Jeanne turned pale and her pretty features were distorted with terror. "But who can bear me such a grudge?" she gasped. "It's terrible. I've never done any one harm. And yet you are certainly right. Worse still—" She finished her sentence in a lower voice: "Worse still, I'm wondering whether the same danger does not threaten my father." "Has he been attacked also?" "No, for he never stirs from his room. But his is such a mysterious illness. He has no strength. He cannot walk at all. In addition to that, he is subject to fits of suffocation, as though his heart stopped beating. Oh, what an awful thing!" Lupin realized all the authority which he was able to assert at such a moment, and he said: "Have no fear, mademoiselle. If you obey me blindly, I shall be sure to succeed." "Yes, yes, I am quite willing. But all this is so terrible." "Trust me, I beg of you. And please listen to me. I shall want a few particulars." He rapped out a number of questions, which Jeanne Darcieux answered hurriedly. "That animal was never let loose, was he?" "Never." "Who used to feed him?" "The lodge keeper. He brought him his food every evening." "Consequently, he could go near him without being bitten?" "Yes, and he only, for the dog was very savage." "You don't suspect the man?" "Oh, no! Baptiste? Never." "And you can't think of anybody?" "No. Our servants are quite devoted to us. They are very fond of me." "You have no friends staying in the house?" "No." No brother?" "No." "Then your father is your only protector?" "Yes, and I have told you the condition he is in." "Have you told him of the different attempts?" "Yes, and it was wrong of me to do so. Our doctor, old Dr. Guéroult, forbade me to cause him the least excitement." "Your mother?" "I don't remember her. She died 16 years ago. Just 16 years ago." "How old were you then?" "I was not quite 5 years old." "And were you living here?" "We were living in Paris. My father only bought this place the year after." Lupin was silent for a few moments. Then he concluded: "Very well, mademoiselle. I am obliged to you. Those particulars are all I need for the present. Besides, it would not be wise for us to remain together longer." "But," she said, "the lodge keeper will find the dog soon. Who will have killed him?" "You, mademoiselle, to defend yourself against an attack." "I never carry firearms." "I'm afraid you do," said Lupin, smiling, "because you killed the dog; and there is no one but you who could have killed him. For that matter, let them think what they please. The great thing is that I shall not be suspected when I come to the house." "To the house? Do you intend to?" "Yes. I don't yet know how, but I shall come, this very evening. So, once more, be easy in your mind. I will answer for everything." Jeanne looked at him and, dominated by him, conquered by his air of assurance and good faith, she said simply: "I am quite easy." "Then all will go well. Till this evening, mademoiselle." "Till this evening." She walked away; and Lupin, following her with his eyes until the moment when she disappeared round the corner of the house, murmured: "What a pretty creature! It would be a pity if any harm were to come to her. Luckily, Arsène Lupin is keeping his weather eye open." Taking care not to be seen, with eyes and ears attentive to the least sight or sound, he inspected every nook and corner of the grounds, looked for the little low door which he had noticed outside and which was the door of the kitchen garden, drew the bolt, took the key and then skirted the walls and found himself once more near the tree which he had climbed. 2 minutes later, he was mounting his motor cycle. The village of Maupertuis lay quite close to the estate. Lupin inquired and learnt that Dr. Guéroult lived next door to the church. He rang, was shown into the consulting room and introduced himself by his name of Paul Daubreuil, of the Rue de Surène, Paris, adding that he had official relations with the detective service, a fact which he requested might be kept secret. He had become acquainted, by means of a torn letter, with the incidents that had endangered Mlle. Darcieux's life, and he had come to that young lady's assistance. Dr. Guéroult, an old country practitioner, who idolized Jeanne, on hearing Lupin's explanations, at once admitted that those incidents constituted undeniable proofs of a plot. He showed great concern, offered his visitor hospitality and kept him to dinner. The two men talked at length. In the evening, they walked round to the manor house together. The doctor went to the sick man's room, which was on the first floor, and asked leave to bring up a young colleague to whom he intended soon to make over his practice, when he retired. Lupin, on entering, saw Jeanne Darcieux seated by her father's bedside. She suppressed a movement of surprise and, at a sign from the doctor, left the room. The consultation thereupon took place in Lupin's presence. M. Darcieux's face was worn, with much suffering, and his eyes were bright with fever. He complained particularly, that day, of his heart. After the auscultation, he questioned the doctor with obvious anxiety, and each reply seemed to give him relief. He also spoke of Jeanne and expressed his conviction that they were deceiving him and that his daughter had escaped yet more accidents. He continued perturbed, in spite of the doctor's denials. He wanted to have the police informed and inquiries set on foot. But his excitement tired him and he gradually dropped off to sleep. Lupin stopped the doctor in the passage: "Come, doctor, give me your exact opinion. Do you think that Dr. Darcieux's illness can be attributed to an outside cause?" "How do you mean?" "Well, suppose that the same enemy should be interested in removing both father and daughter?" The doctor seemed struck by the suggestion: "Upon my word, there is something in what you say. The father's illness at times adopts such a very unusual character. For instance, the paralysis of the legs, which is almost complete, ought to be accompanied by..." The doctor reflected for a moment and then said in a low voice: "You think it's poison, of course. But what poison? Besides, I see no toxic symptoms. It would have to be... But what are you doing? What's the matter?" The two men were talking outside a little sitting room on the first floor, where Jeanne, seizing the opportunity while the doctor was with her father, had begun her evening meal. Lupin, who was watching her through the open door, saw her lift a cup to her lips and take a few sups. Suddenly, he rushed at her and caught her by the arm: "What are you drinking there?" "What!" she said, taken aback. "Only tea!" "You pulled a face of disgust. What made you do that?" "I don't know. I thought...." "You thought what?" "That it tasted rather bitter. But I expect that comes from the medicine I mixed with it." "What medicine?" "Some drops which I take at dinner. The drops which you prescribed for me, you know, doctor." "Yes," said Dr. Guéroult, "but that medicine has no taste of any kind. You know it hasn't, Jeanne, for you have been taking it for a fortnight and this is the first time." "Quite right," said the girl, "and this does have a taste. There. Oh! My mouth is still burning." Dr. Guéroult now took a sip from the cup. "Pah!" he exclaimed, spitting it out again. "There's no mistake about it." Lupin, on his side, was examining the bottle containing the medicine; and he asked: "Where is this bottle kept in the daytime?" But Jeanne was unable to answer. She had put her hand to her heart and, wan faced, with staring eyes, seemed to be suffering great pain. It hurts. It hurts," she stammered. The two men quickly carried her to her room and laid her on the bed. "She ought to have an emetic," said Lupin. "Open the cupboard," said the doctor. "You'll see a medicine case. Have you got it? Take out one of those little tubes. Yes, that one. And now some hot water. You'll find some on the tea tray in the other room." Jeanne's own maid came running up in answer to the bell. Lupin told her that Mlle. Darcieux had been taken unwell, for some unknown reason. He next returned to the little dining room, inspected the sideboard and the cupboards, went down to the kitchen and pretended that the doctor had sent him to ask about M. Darcieux's diet. Without appearing to do so, he catechized the cook, the butler and Baptiste, the lodge keeper, who had his meals at the manor house with the servants. Then he went back to the doctor: "Well?" "She's asleep." "Any danger?" "No. Fortunately, she had only taken 2 or 3 sips. But this is the second time to day that you have saved her life, as the analysis of this bottle will show." "Quite superfluous to make an analysis, doctor. There is no doubt about the fact that there has been an attempt at poisoning." "By whom?" "I can't say. But the demon who is engineering all this business clearly knows the ways of the house. He comes and goes as he pleases, walks about in the park, files the dog's chain, mixes poison with the food and, in short, moves and acts precisely as though he were living the life of her, or rather of those, whom he wants to put away." "You really believe that M. Darcieux is threatened with the same danger?" "I have not a doubt of it." "Then it must be one of the servants. But that is most unlikely. Do you think...." "I think nothing, doctor. I know nothing. All I can say is that the situation is most tragic and that we must be prepared for the worst. Death is here, doctor, shadowing the people in this house; and it will soon strike at those whom it is pursuing." "What's to be done?" "Watch, doctor. Let us pretend that we are alarmed about M. Darcieux's health and spend the night in here. The bedrooms of both the father and daughter are close by. If anything happens, we are sure to hear." There was an easy chair in the room. They arranged to sleep in it and turn about. In reality, Lupin slept for only 2 or 3 hours. In the middle of the night, he left the room, without disturbing his companion, carefully looked round the whole of the house and walked out through the principal gate. Chapter 6, Part 2. Of the Confessions of Arsène Lupin. This recording is in the public domain. The Confessions of Arsène Lupin, by Maurice LeBlanc. CHAPTER VI. SHADOWED BY DEATH. He reached Paris on his motor cycle at 9 o'clock in the morning. 2 of his friends, to whom he telephoned on the road, met him there. They all 3 spent the day in making searches which Lupin had planned out beforehand. He set out again hurriedly at 6 o'clock. And never, perhaps, as he told me subsequently, did he risk his life with greater temerity than in his break-neck ride, at a mad rate of speed, on a foggy December evening, with the light of his lamp hardly able to pierce through the darkness. He sprang from his bicycle outside the gate, which was still open, ran to the house and reached the first floor in a few bounds. There was no one in the little dining room. Without hesitating, without knocking, he walked into Jeanne's bedroom. "Oh, here you are!" he said, with a sigh of relief, seeing Jeanne and the doctor sitting side by side, talking. "What? Any news?" asked the doctor, alarmed at seeing such a state of agitation in a man whose coolness he had had occasion to observe. "No," said Lupin, "no news. And here?" "None here either. We have just left M. Darcieux. He has had an excellent day and he ate his dinner with a good appetite. As for Jeanne, you can see for yourself, she has all her pretty colour back again." "Then she must go." "Go? But it's out of the question!" protested the girl. "You must go, you must!" cried Lupin, with real violence, stamping his foot on the floor. He at once mastered himself, spoke a few words of apology and then, for 3 or 4 minutes, preserved a complete silence, which the doctor and Jeanne were careful not to disturb. At last he said to the young girl: "You shall go to morrow morning, mademoiselle. It will be only for 1 or 2 weeks. I will take you to your friend at Versailles, the one to whom you were writing. I entreat you to get everything ready to night, without concealment of any kind. Let the servants know that you are going. On the other hand, the doctor will be good enough to tell M. Darcieux and give him to understand, with every possible precaution, that this journey is essential to your safety. Besides, he can join you as soon as his strength permits. That's settled, is it not?" "Yes," she said, absolutely dominated by Lupin's gentle and imperious voice. "In that case," he said, "be as quick as you can and do not stir from your room." "But," said the girl, with a shudder, "am I to stay alone to night?" "Fear nothing. Should there be the least danger, the doctor and I will come back. Do not open your door unless you hear 3 very light taps." Jeanne at once rang for her maid. The doctor went to M. Darcieux, while Lupin had some supper brought to him in the little dining room. "That's done," said the doctor, returning to him in 20 minutes' time. "M. Darcieux did not raise any great difficulty. As a matter of fact, he himself thinks it just as well that we should send Jeanne away." They then went downstairs together and left the house. On reaching the lodge, Lupin called the keeper: "You can shut the gate, my man. If M. Darcieux should want us, send for us at once." The clock of Maupertuis church struck 10. The sky was overcast with black clouds, through which the moon broke at moments. The 2 men walked on for 60 or 70 yards. They were nearing the village, when Lupin gripped his companion by the arm: "Stop!" "What on earth's the matter?" exclaimed the doctor. "The matter is this," Lupin jerked out, "that if my calculations turn out right, if I have not misjudged the business from start to finish, Mlle. Darcieux will be murdered before the night is out." "Eh? What's that?" gasped the doctor, in dismay. "But then why did we go?" "With the precise object that the miscreant, who is watching all our movements in the dark, may not postpone his crime and may perpetrate it, not at the hour chosen by himself, but at the hour which I have decided upon." "Then we are returning to the manor house." "Yes, of course we are, but separately." "In that case, let us go at once." "Listen to me, doctor," said Lupin, in a steady voice, "and let us waste no time in useless words. Above all, we must defeat any attempt to watch us. You will therefore go straight home and not come out again until you are quite certain that you have not been followed. You will then make for the walls of the property, keeping to the left, till you come to the little door of the kitchen garden. Here is the key. When the church clock strikes 11, open the door very gently and walk right up to the terrace at the back of the house. The 5th window is badly fastened. You have only to climb over the balcony. As soon as you are inside Mlle. Darcieux's room, bolt the door and don't budge. You quite understand, don't budge, either of you, whatever happens. I have noticed that Mlle. Darcieux leaves her dressing-room window ajar, isn't that so?" "Yes, it's a habit which I taught her." "That's the way they'll come." "And you?" "That's the way I shall come also." "And do you know who the villain is?" Lupin hesitated and then replied: "No, I don't know. And that is just how we shall find out. But I implore you, keep cool. Not a word, not a movement, whatever happens." "I promise you." "I want more than that, doctor. You must give me your word of honour." "I give you my word of honour." The doctor went away. Lupin at once climbed a neighbouring mound from which he could see the windows of the 1st and 2nd floor. Several of them were lighted. He waited for some little time. The lights went out one by one. Then, taking a direction opposite to that in which the doctor had gone, he branched off to the right and skirted the wall until he came to the clump of trees near which he had hidden his motor-cycle on the day before. 11 o'clock struck. He calculated the time which it would take the doctor to cross the kitchen garden and make his way into the house. "That's 1 point scored," he muttered. "Everything's all right on that side. And now, Lupin to the rescue?" The enemy won't be long before he plays his last trump. And by all the gods, I must be there." He went through the same performance as on the first occasion, pulled down the branch and hoisted himself to the top of the wall, from which he was able to reach the bigger boughs of the tree. Just then he pricked up his ears. He seemed to hear a rustling of dead leaves; and he actually perceived a dark form moving on the level 30 yards away. "Hang it all!" he said to himself. "I'm done. The scoundrel has smelt a rat." A moonbeam pierced through the clouds. Lupin distinctly saw the man take aim. He tried to jump to the ground and turned his head. But he felt something hit him in the chest, heard the sound of a report, uttered an angry oath and came crashing down from branch to branch, like a corpse. Meanwhile, Dr. Guéroult, following Arsène Lupin's instructions, had climbed the ledge of the fifth window and groped his way to the first floor. On reaching Jeanne's room, he tapped lightly 3 times at the door and, immediately on entering, pushed the bolt. "Lie down at once," he whispered to the girl, who had not taken off her things. "You must appear to have gone to bed. It's cold in here. Is the window open in your dressing room?" "Yes. Would you like me to—" "No, leave it as it is. They are coming." "They are coming?" spluttered Jeanne, in a fright. "Yes, beyond a doubt." "But who? Do you suspect any one?" "I don't know who. I expect that there is some one hidden in the house ... or in the park." "Oh, I feel so frightened!" "Don't be frightened. The sportsman who's looking after you seems jolly clever and makes a point of playing a safe game. I expect he's on the lookout in the court." The doctor put out the night light, went to the window and raised the blind. A narrow cornice, running along the first storey, prevented him from seeing more than a distant part of the courtyard; and he came back and sat down by the bed. Some very painful minutes passed, minutes that appeared to them interminably long. The clock in the village struck; but, taken up as they were with all the little noises of the night, they hardly noticed the sound. They listened, with all their nerves on edge. "Did you hear?" whispered the doctor. "Yes, yes," said Jeanne, sitting up in bed. Lie down," he said presently. "There's some one coming." There was a little tapping sound outside, against the cornice. Next came a series of indistinct noises, the nature of which they could not make out for certain. But they had a feeling that the window in the dressing room was being opened wider, for they were buffeted by gusts of cold air. Suddenly, it became quite clear: there was some one next door. The doctor, whose hand was trembling a little, seized his revolver. Nevertheless, he did not move, remembering the formal orders which he had received and fearing to act against them. The room was in absolute darkness; and they were unable to see where the adversary was, but they felt his presence. They followed his invisible movements, the sound of his footsteps deadened by the carpet, and they did not doubt but that he had already crossed the threshold of the room. And the adversary stopped. Of that they were certain. He was standing 6 steps away from the bed, motionless, undecided perhaps, seeking to pierce the darkness with his keen eyes. Jeanne's hand, icy cold and clammy, trembled in the doctor's grasp. With his other hand, the doctor clutched his revolver, with his finger on the trigger. In spite of his pledged word, he did not hesitate. If the adversary touched the end of the bed, the shot would be fired at a venture. The adversary took another step and then stopped again. And there was something awful about that silence, that impassive silence, that darkness in which those human beings were peering at one another, wildly. Who was it looming in the murky darkness? Who was the man? What horrible enmity was it that turned his hand against the girl, and what abominable aim was he pursuing? Terrified though they were, Jeanne and the doctor thought only of that one thing: to see, to learn the truth, to gaze upon the adversary's face. He took one more step and did not move again. It seemed to them that his figure stood out, darker, against the dark space, and that his arm rose slowly, slowly. A minute passed and then another minute. And suddenly, beyond the man, on the right, a sharp click. A bright light flashed, was flung upon the man, lit him full in the face, remorselessly. Jeanne gave a cry of affright. She had seen, standing over her, with a dagger in his hand, she had seen her father. Almost at the same time, though the light was already turned off, there came a report. The doctor had fired. "Dash it all, don't shoot!" roared Lupin. He threw his arms round the doctor, who choked out:
"Didn't you see? Didn't you see? Listen, he's escaping."
"Let him escape. It's the best thing that could happen." He pressed the spring of his electric lantern again, ran to the dressing room, made certain that the man had disappeared and, returning quietly to the table, lit the lamp. Jeanne lay on her bed, pallid, in a dead faint. The doctor, huddled in his chair, emitted inarticulate sounds. "Come," said Lupin, laughing, "pull yourself together. There is nothing to excite ourselves about. It's all over." "Her father! Her father!" moaned the old doctor. "If you please, doctor, Mlle. Darcieux is ill. Look after her." Without more words, Lupin went back to the dressing room and stepped out on the window ledge. A ladder stood against the ledge. He ran down it. Skirting the wall of the house, 20 steps farther, he tripped over the rungs of a rope ladder, which he climbed, and found himself in M. Darcieux's bedroom. The room was empty. "Just so," he said. "My gentleman did not like the position and has cleared out. Here's wishing him a good journey. And, of course, the door is bolted? Exactly. That is how our sick man, tricking his worthy medical attendant, used to get up at night in full security, fasten his rope ladder to the balcony and prepare his little games. He's no fool, is friend Darcieux." He drew the bolts and returned to Jeanne's room. The doctor, who was just coming out of the doorway, drew him to the little dining room. "She's asleep. Don't let us disturb her. She has had a bad shock and will take some time to recover." Lupin poured himself out a glass of water and drank it down. Then he took a chair and, calmly: "Pooh, she'll be all right by to morrow." "What do you say?" "I say that she'll be all right by to morrow." "Why?" "In the first place, because it did not strike me that Mlle. Darcieux felt any very great affection for her father." "Never mind. Think of it, a father who tries to kill his daughter! A father who, for months on end, repeats his monstrous attempt 4, 5, 6 times over again! Well, isn't that enough to blight a less sensitive soul than Jeanne's for good and all? What a hateful memory!" "She will forget." "One does not forget such a thing as that." "She will forget, doctor, and for a very simple reason." "Explain yourself." "She is not M. Darcieux's daughter." "Eh?" "I repeat, she is not that villain's daughter." "What do you mean? M. Darcieux...." "M. Darcieux is only her stepfather. She had just been born when her father, the real father, died. Jeanne's mother then married a cousin of her husband's, a man bearing the same name, and she died within a year of her second wedding. She left Jeanne in M. Darcieux's charge. He first took her abroad and then bought this country house; and, as nobody knew him in the neighbourhood, he represented the child as being his daughter. She herself did not know the truth about her birth." The doctor sat confounded. He asked: "Are you sure of your facts?" "I spent my day in the town halls of the Paris municipalities. I searched the registers. I interviewed 2 solicitors. I have seen all the documents. There is no doubt possible." "But that does not explain the crime, or rather the series of crimes." "Yes, it does," declared Lupin. "And from the start, from the first hour when I meddled in this business, some words which Mlle. Darcieux used made me suspect that direction which my investigations must take. 'I was not quite 5 years old when my mother died,' she said. That was 16 years ago. Mlle. Darcieux, therefore, was nearly 21, that is to say, she was on the verge of attaining her majority. I at once saw that this was an important detail. The day on which you reach your majority is the day on which your accounts are rendered. What was the financial position of Mlle. Darcieux, who was her mother's natural heiress? Of course, I did not think of the father for a second. To begin with, one can't imagine a thing like that. And then the farce which M. Darcieux was playing: helpless, bedridden, ill." "Really ill?" interrupted the doctor. "All this diverted suspicion from him, the more so as I believe that he himself was exposed to criminal attacks. But was there not in the family some person who would be interested in their removal? My journey to Paris revealed the truth to me. Mlle. Darcieux inherits a large fortune from her mother, of which her stepfather draws the income. The solicitor was to have called a meeting of the family in Paris next month. The truth would have been out. It meant ruin to M. Darcieux." "Then he had put no money by?" "Yes, but he had lost a great deal as the result of unfortunate speculations." "But, after all, Jeanne would not have taken the management of her fortune out of his hands." "There is one detail which you do not know, doctor, and which I learned from reading the torn letter. Mlle. Darcieux is in love with the brother of Marceline, her Versailles friend. M. Darcieux was opposed to the marriage. And you now see the reason she was waiting until she came of age to be married." "You're right," said the doctor. "You're right. It meant his ruin." "His absolute ruin. One chance of saving himself remained: the death of his step daughter, of whom he is the next heir." "Certainly, but on condition that no one suspected him." "Of course. And that is why he contrived the series of accidents, so that the death might appear to be due to misadventure. And that is why I, on my side, wishing to bring things to a head, asked you to tell him of Mlle. Darcieux's impending departure. From that moment, it was no longer enough for the would-be sick man to wander about the grounds and the passages, in the dark, and execute some leisurely thought-out plan. No, he had to act at once, without preparation, violently, dagger in hand. I had no doubt that he would decide to do it. And he did." "Then he had no suspicions?" "Of me, yes. He felt that I would return to night, and he kept a watch at the place where I had already climbed the wall." "Well?" "Well," said Lupin, laughing, "I received a bullet full in the chest, or rather my pocket book received a bullet. Here, you can see the hole. So I tumbled from the tree like a dead man. Thinking that he was rid of his only adversary, he went back to the house. I saw him prowl about for 2 hours. Then, making up his mind, he went to the coach-house, took a ladder and set it against the window. I had only to follow him." The doctor reflected and said: "You could have collared him earlier. Why did you let him come up? It was a sore trial for Jeanne. And unnecessary." "On the contrary, it was indispensable. Mlle. Darcieux would never have accepted the truth. It was essential that she should see the murderer's very face. You must tell her all the circumstances when she awakes. She will soon be well again." "But M. Darcieux?" "You can explain his disappearance as you think best. A sudden journey, a fit of madness. There will be a few inquiries. And you may be sure that he will never be heard of again." The doctor nodded his head: "Yes, that is so. That is so. You are right. You have managed all this business with extraordinary skill. And Jeanne owes you her life. She will thank you in person. But now, can I be of use to you in any way? You told me that you were connected with the detective service. Will you allow me to write and praise your conduct, your courage?" Lupin began to laugh: "Certainly. A letter of that kind will do me a world of good. You might write to my immediate superior, Chief Inspector Ganimard. He will be glad to hear that his favourite officer, Paul Daubreuil, of the Rue de Surène, has once again distinguished himself by a brilliant action. As it happens, I have an appointment to meet him about a case of which you may have heard: the case of the red scarf. How pleased my dear M. Ganimard will be!" Chapter 7 of the Confessions of Arsène Lupin. This recording is in the public domain. The Confessions of Arsène Lupin, by Maurice LeBlanc. Chapter 7: A tragedy in the forest of Morges. The village was terror-stricken. It was on a Sunday morning. The peasants of Saint Nicolas and the neighbourhood were coming out of church and spreading across the square when, suddenly, the women who were walking ahead and who had already turned into the high road fell back with loud cries of dismay. At the same moment, an enormous motor-car, looking like some appalling monster, came tearing into sight at a headlong rate of speed. Amid the shouts of the madly scattering people, it made straight for the church, swerved, just as it seemed about to dash itself to pieces against the steps, grazed the wall of the presbytery, regained the continuation of the national road, dashed along, turned the corner and disappeared, without, by some incomprehensible miracle, having so much as brushed against any of the persons crowding the square. But they had seen. They had seen a man in the driver's seat, wrapped in a goatskin coat, with a fur cap on his head and his face disguised in a pair of large goggles, and with him, on the front of that seat, flung back, bent in two, a woman whose head, all covered with blood, hung down over the bonnet. And they had heard. They had heard the woman's screams, screams of horror, screams of agony. And it was all such a vision of hell and carnage that the people stood, for some seconds, motionless, stupefied. "Blood!" roared somebody. There was blood everywhere, on the cobblestones of the square, on the ground hardened by the first frosts of autumn; and when a number of men and boys rushed off in pursuit of the motor, they had but to take those sinister marks for their guide. The marks, on their part, followed the high road, but in a very strange manner, going from one side to the other and leaving a zigzag track, in the wake of the tires, that made those who saw it shudder. How was it that the car had not bumped against that tree? How had it been righted, instead of smashing into that bank? What novice, what madman, what drunkard, what frightened criminal was driving that motor car with such astounding bounds and swerves? One of the peasants declared: "They will never do the turn in the forest." And another said: "Of course they won't. She's bound to upset." The forest of Morgues began at half a mile beyond Saint Nicolas; and the road, which was straight up to that point, except for a slight bend where it left the village, started climbing, immediately after entering the forest, and made an abrupt turn among the rocks and trees. No motor car was able to take this turn without first slackening speed. There were posts to give notice of the danger. The breathless peasants reached the quincunx of beeches that formed the edge of the forest; and one of them at once cried: "There you are! What? Upset!" The car, a limousine, had turned turtle and lay smashed, twisted and shapeless. Beside it, the woman's dead body. But the most horrible, sordid, stupefying thing was the woman's head, crushed, flattened, invisible under a block of stone, a huge block of stone lodged there by some unknown and prodigious agency. As for the man in the goatskin coat, he was nowhere to be found. He was not found on the scene of the accident. He was not found either in the neighbourhood. Moreover, some workmen coming down the Côte de Morgues declared that they had not seen anybody. The man, therefore, had taken refuge in the woods. The gendarmes, who were at once sent for, made a minute search, assisted by the peasants, but discovered nothing. In the same way, the examining magistrates, after a close inquiry lasting for several days, found no clue capable of throwing the least light upon this inscrutable tragedy. On the contrary, the investigations only led to further mysteries and further improbabilities. Thus it was ascertained that the block of stone came from where there had been a landslip, at least 40 yards away; and the murderer, in a few minutes, had carried it all that distance and flung it on his victim's head. On the other hand, the murderer, who was most certainly not hiding in the forest, for if so he must inevitably have been discovered, the forest being of limited extent, had the audacity, 8 days after the crime, to come back to the turn on the hill and leave his goatskin coat there. Why? With what object? There was nothing in the pockets of the coat, except a corkscrew and a napkin. What did it all mean? Inquiries were made of the builder of the motor car, who recognized the limousine as one which he had sold, 3 years ago, to a Russian. The said Russian, declared the manufacturer, had sold it again at once. To whom? No one knew. The car bore no number. Then again, it was impossible to identify the dead woman's body. Her clothes and underclothing were not marked in any way; and the face was quite unknown. Meanwhile, detectives were going along the national road in the direction opposite to that taken by the actors in this mysterious tragedy. But who was to prove that the car had followed that particular road on the previous night? They examined every yard of the ground, they questioned everybody. At last they succeeded in learning that, on the Saturday evening, a limousine had stopped outside a grocer's shop in a small town situated about 200 miles from Saint Nicolas, on a highway branching out of the national road. The driver had first filled his tank, bought some spare cans of petrol, and lastly taken away a small stock of provisions: a ham, fruit, biscuits, wine and a half bottle of 3-Star brandy. There was a lady on the driver's seat. She did not get down. The blinds of the limousine were drawn. One of these blinds was seen to move several times. The shopman was positive that there was somebody inside. Presuming the shopman's evidence to be correct, then the problem became even more complicated, for so far no clue had revealed the presence of a third person. Meanwhile, as the travellers had supplied themselves with provisions, it remained to be discovered what they had done with them and what had become of the remains. The detectives retraced their steps. It was not until they came to the fork of the two roads, at a spot 11 or 12 miles from Saint Nicolas, that they met a shepherd who, in answer to their questions, directed them to a neighbouring field, hidden from view behind the screen of bushes, where he had seen an empty bottle and other things. The detectives were convinced at the first examination. The motor car had stopped there, and the unknown travellers, probably after a night's rest in their car, had breakfasted and resumed their journey in the course of the morning. One unmistakable proof was the half bottle of 3-Star brandy sold by the grocer. This bottle had its neck broken clean off with a stone. The stone employed for the purpose was picked up, as was the neck of the bottle, with its cork, covered with a tin foil seal. The seal showed marks of attempts that had been made to uncork the bottle in the ordinary manner. The detectives continued their search and followed a ditch that ran along the field at right angles to the road. It ended in a little spring, hidden under brambles, which seemed to emit an offensive smell. On lifting the brambles, they perceived a corpse, the corpse of a man whose head had been smashed in, so that it formed little more than a sort of pulp, swarming with vermin. The body was dressed in jacket and trousers of dark brown leather. The pockets were empty: no papers, no pocket book, no watch. The grocer and his shopman were summoned and, 2 days later, formally identified, by his dress and figure, the traveller who had bought the petrol and provisions on the Saturday evening. The whole case, therefore, had to be reopened on a fresh basis. The authorities were confronted with a tragedy no longer enacted by 2 persons, a man and a woman, of whom one had killed the other, but by 3 persons, including 2 victims, of whom one was the very man who was accused of killing his companion. As to the murderer, there was no doubt. He was the person who travelled inside the motor car and who took the precaution to remain concealed behind the curtains. He had first got rid of the driver and rifled his pockets, and then, after wounding the woman, carried her off in a mad dash for death. Given a fresh case, unexpected discoveries, unforeseen evidence, one might have hoped that the mystery would be cleared up, or, at least, that the inquiry would point a few steps along the road to the truth. But not at all. The corpse was simply placed beside the first corpse. New problems were added to the old. The accusation of murder was shifted from the one to the other. And there it ended. Outside those tangible, obvious facts, there was nothing but darkness. The name of the woman, the name of the man, the name of the murderer were so many riddles. And then what had become of the murderer? If he had disappeared from one moment to the other, that in itself would have been a tolerably curious phenomenon. But the phenomenon was actually something very like a miracle, inasmuch as the murderer had not absolutely disappeared. He was there. He made a practice of returning to the scene of the catastrophe. In addition to the goatskin coat, a fur cap was picked up one day; and, by way of an unparalleled prodigy, one morning, after a whole night spent on guard in the rock, beside the famous turning, the detectives found, on the grass of the turning itself, a pair of motor goggles, broken, rusty, dirty, done for. How had the murderer managed to bring back those goggles unseen by the detectives? And, above all, why had he brought them back? Men's brains reeled in the presence of such abnormalities. They were almost afraid to pursue the ambiguous adventure. They received the impression of a heavy, stifling, breathless atmosphere, which dimmed the eyes and baffled the most clear-sighted. The magistrate in charge of the case fell ill. 4 days later, his successor confessed that the matter was beyond him. 2 tramps were arrested and at once released. Another was pursued, but not caught. Moreover, there was no evidence of any sort or kind against him. In short, it was nothing but one helpless muddle of mist and contradiction. An accident, the merest accident, led to the solution, or rather produced a series of circumstances that ended by leading to the solution. A reporter on the staff of an important Paris paper, who had been sent to make investigations on the spot, concluded his article with the following words: "I repeat, therefore, that we must wait for fresh events, fresh facts. We must wait for some lucky accident. As things stand, we are simply wasting our time. The elements of truth are not even sufficient to suggest a plausible theory. We are in the midst of the most absolute, painful, impenetrable darkness. There is nothing to be done. All the Sherlock Holmeses in the world would not know what to make of the mystery, and Arsène Lupin himself, if he will allow me to say so, would have to pay forfeit here." On the day after the appearance of that article, the newspaper in question printed this telegram: "Have sometimes paid forfeit, but never over such a silly thing as this. The Saint Nicolas tragedy is a mystery for babies." And the editor added: "We insert this telegram as a matter of curiosity, for it is obviously the work of a wag. Arsène Lupin, past master though he be in the art of practical joking, would be the last man to display such childish flippancy." 2 days elapsed, and then the paper published the famous letter, so precise and categorical in its conclusions, in which Arsène Lupin furnished the solution of the problem. I quote it in full: "Sir, you have taken me on my weak side by defying me. You challenge me, and I accept the challenge. And I will begin by declaring once more that the Saint Nicolas tragedy is a mystery for babies. I know nothing so simple, so natural; and the proof of the simplicity shall lie in the succinctness of my demonstration. It is contained in these few words: when a crime seems to go beyond the ordinary scope of things, when it seems unusual and stupid, then there are many chances that its explanation is to be found in superordinary, supernatural, superhuman motives. I say that there are many chances, for we must always allow for the part played by absurdity in the most logical and commonplace events. But of course it is impossible to see things as they are and not to take account of the absurd and the disproportionate. I was struck from the very beginning by that very evident character of unusualness. We have first of all the awkward, zigzag course of the motor car, which would give one the impression that the car was driven by a novice. People have spoken of a drunkard or a madman, a justifiable supposition in itself. But neither madness nor drunkenness would account for the incredible strength required to transport, especially in so short a space of time, the stone with which the unfortunate woman's head was crushed. That proceeding called for a muscular power so great that I do not hesitate to look upon it as a second sign of the unusualness that marks the whole tragedy. And why move that enormous stone to finish off the victim, when a mere pebble would have done the work? Why again was the murderer not killed, or at least reduced to a temporary state of helplessness, in the terrible somersault turned by the car? How did he disappear? And why, having disappeared, did he return to the scene of the accident? Why did he throw his fur coat there? Then on another day his cap, then on another day his goggles? Unusual, useless, stupid acts. Why, besides, convey that wounded, dying woman on the driver's seat of the car, where everybody could see her? Why do that, instead of putting her inside, or flinging her into some corner, dead, just as the man was flung under the brambles in the ditch? Unusualness, stupidity. Everything in the whole story is absurd. Everything points to hesitation, incoherency, awkwardness, the silliness of a child, or rather of a mad, blundering savage, of a brute. Look at the bottle of brandy. There was a corkscrew. It was found in the pocket of the greatcoat. Did the murderer use it? Yes, the marks of the corkscrew can be seen on the seal. But the operation was too complicated for him. He broke the neck with a stone. Always stones, observe that detail. They are the only weapon, the only implement which the creature employs. It is his customary weapon, his familiar implement. He kills the man with a stone, he kills the woman with a stone, and he opens bottles with a stone. A brute, I repeat, a savage. Disordered, unhinged, suddenly driven mad. By what? Why, of course, by that same brandy, which he swallowed at a draught while the driver and his companion were having breakfast in the field. He got out of the limousine, in which he was travelling, in his goatskin coat and his fur cap, took the bottle, broke off the neck and drank. There is the whole story. Having drunk, he went raving mad and hit out at random, without reason. Then, seized with instinctive fear, dreading the inevitable punishment, he hid the body of the man. Then, like an idiot, he took up the wounded woman and ran away. He ran away in that motor car which he did not know how to work, but which to him represented safety, escape from capture. But the money, you will ask, the stolen pocket-book? Why, who says that he was the thief? Who says that it was not some passing tramp, some labourer, guided by the stench of the corpse? Very well, you object, but the brute would have been found, as he is hiding somewhere near the turn, and as after all he must eat and drink. Well, well, I see that you have not yet understood. The simplest way, I suppose, to have done and to answer your questions is to make straight for the mark. Then let the gentlemen of the police and the gendarmerie themselves make straight for the mark. Let them take firearms. Let them explore the forest within a radius of 200 or 300 yards from the turn, no more. But instead of exploring with their heads down and their eyes fixed on the ground, let them look up into the air, yes, into the air, among the leaves and branches of the tallest oaks and the most unlikely beeches. And believe me, they will see him, for he is there. He is there, bewildered, piteously at a loss, seeking for the man and woman whom he has killed, looking for them and waiting for them, and not daring to go away, and quite unable to understand. I myself am exceedingly sorry that I am kept in town by urgent private affairs, and by some complicated matters of business which I have to set going, for I should much have liked to see the end of this rather curious adventure. Pray, therefore, excuse me to my kind friends in the police, and permit me to be, sir. The upshot will be remembered. The gentlemen of the police and the gendarmerie shrugged their shoulders and paid no attention to this lucubration. But 4 of the local country gentry took their rifles and went shooting, with their eyes fixed skyward, as though they meant to pot a few rooks. In half an hour they had caught sight of the murderer. 2 shots and he came tumbling from bough to bough. He was only wounded, and they took him alive. That evening, a Paris paper, which did not yet know of the capture, printed the following paragraphs: "Inquiries are being made after a Monsieur and Madame Bragoff, who landed at Marseilles 6 weeks ago and there hired a motor car. They had been living in Australia for many years, during which time they had not visited Europe, and they wrote to the director of the Jardin d'Acclimatation, with whom they were in the habit of corresponding, that they were bringing with them a curious creature, of an entirely unknown species, of which it was difficult to say whether it was a man or a monkey. According to M. Bragoff, who is an eminent archaeologist, the specimen in question is the anthropoid ape, or rather the ape man, the existence of which had not hitherto been definitely proved. The structure is said to be exactly similar to that of Pithecanthropus erectus, discovered by Dr. Dubois in Java in 1891. This curious, intelligent and observant animal acted as its owner's servant on their property in Australia, and used to clean their motor car and even attempt to drive it. The question that is being asked is, where are Monsieur and Madame Bragoff? Where is the strange primate that landed with them at Marseilles? The answer to this question was now made easy. Thanks to the hints supplied by Arsène Lupin, all the elements of the tragedy were known. Thanks to him, the culprit was in the hands of the law. You can see him at the Jardin d'Acclimatation, where he is locked up under the name of 3 Stars. He is, in point of fact, a monkey, but he is also a man. He has the gentleness and the wisdom of the domestic animals, and the sadness which they feel when their master dies; but he has many other qualities that bring him much closer to humanity. He is treacherous, cruel, idle, greedy and quarrelsome, and above all, he is immoderately fond of brandy. Apart from that, he is a monkey. Unless, indeed... A few days after 3 Stars' arrest, I saw Arsène Lupin standing in front of his cage. Lupin was manifestly trying to solve this interesting problem for himself. I at once said, for I had set my heart upon having the matter out with him: "You know, Lupin, that intervention of yours, your argument, your letter, in short, did not surprise me so much as you might think." "Oh, really?" he said calmly. "And why?" "Why? Because the incident has occurred before, 70 or 80 years ago. Edgar Allan Poe made it the subject of one of his finest tales. In those circumstances, the key to the riddle was easy enough to find." Arsène Lupin took my arm and, walking away with me, said: "When did you guess it yourself?" "On reading your letter," I confessed. "And at what part of my letter?" "At the end." "At the end, eh? After I had dotted all the i's. So here is a crime which accident causes to be repeated, under quite different conditions, it is true, but still with the same sort of hero. And your eyes had to be opened, as well as other people's. It needed the assistance of my letter, the letter in which I amused myself, apart from the exigencies of the facts, by employing the argument and sometimes the identical words used by the American poet in a story which everybody has read. So you see that my letter was not absolutely useless, and that one may safely venture to repeat to people things which they have learnt, only to forget them." Wherewith Lupin turned on his heel and burst out laughing in the face of an old monkey, who sat with the air of a philosopher, gravely meditating. Chapter 8, Part 1 of The Confessions of Arsène Lupin. This recording is in the public domain. The Confessions of Arsène Lupin, by Maurice LeBlanc. Chapter 8. Lupin's marriage. Monsieur Arsène Lupin has the honour to inform you of his approaching marriage with Mademoiselle Angélique de Sarzeau-Vendôme, Princesse de Bourbon-Condé, and to request the pleasure of your company at the wedding, which will take place at the church of Sainte Clotilde. The Duc de Sarzeau-Vendôme has the honour to inform you of the approaching marriage of his daughter Angélique, Princesse de Bourbon-Condé, with Monsieur Arsène Lupin, and to request... Jean, Duc de Sarzeau-Vendôme, could not finish reading the invitations which he held in his trembling hand. Pale with anger, his long lean body shaking with tremors: "There," he gasped, handing the 2 communications to his daughter. "This is what our friends have received. This has been the talk of Paris since yesterday. What do you say to that dastardly insult, Angélique? What would your poor mother say to it, if she were alive?" Angélique was tall and thin like her father, skinny and angular like him. She was 33 years of age, always dressed in black stuff, shy and retiring in manner, with a head too small in proportion to her height, and narrowed on either side until the nose seemed to jut forth in protest against such parsimony. and yet it would be impossible to say that she was ugly, for her eyes were extremely beautiful, soft and grave, proud and a little sad, pathetic eyes which to see once was to remember. She flushed with shame at hearing her father's words, which told her the scandal of which she was the victim. But as she loved him, notwithstanding his harshness to her, his injustice and despotism, she said: "Oh, I think it must be meant for a joke, father, to which we need pay no attention." "A joke? Why, every one is gossiping about it. A dozen papers have printed the confounded notice this morning, with satirical comments. They quote our pedigree, our ancestors, our illustrious dead. They pretend to take the thing seriously. Still, no one could believe. Of course not, but that doesn't prevent us from being the byword of Paris. It will all be forgotten by to-morrow. To-morrow, my girl, people will remember that the name of Angélique de Sarzeau-Vendôme has been bandied about as it should not be. Oh, if I could find out the name of the scoundrel who has dared—" At that moment, Hyacinthe, the duke's valet, came in and said that Monsieur le Duc was wanted on the telephone. Still fuming, he took down the receiver and growled: "Well, who is it?" "Yes, it's the Duc de Sarzeau-Vendôme speaking." A voice replied: "I want to apologize to you, Monsieur le Duc, and to Mademoiselle Angélique. It's my secretary's fault." "Your secretary?" "Yes, the invitations were only a rough draft which I meant to submit to you. Unfortunately, my secretary thought—" "But tell me, monsieur, who are you?" "What, Monsieur le Duc, don't you know my voice? The voice of your future son-in-law?" "What?" "Arsène Lupin." The duke dropped into a chair. His face was livid. "Arsène Lupin! It's he! Arsène Lupin!" Angélique gave a smile: "You see, father, it's only a joke, a hoax." But the duke's rage broke out afresh and he began to walk up and down, moving his arms: "I shall go to the police. The fellow can't be allowed to make a fool of me in this way. If there's any law left in the land, it must be stopped." Hyacinthe entered the room again. He brought 2 visiting cards. "Chautois? Le Petit?" "Don't know them." "They are both journalists, Monsieur le Duc." "What do they want?" "They would like to speak to Monsieur le Duc with regard to the marriage." "Turn them out!" exclaimed the duke. "Kick them out! And tell the porter not to admit scum of that sort to my house in future." "Please, father," Angélique ventured to say. "As for you, shut up. If you had consented to marry one of your cousins when I wanted you to, this wouldn't have happened." The same evening, one of the 2 reporters printed, on the front page of his paper, a somewhat fanciful story of his expedition to the family mansion of the Sarzeau-Vendômes in the Rue de Varennes, and expatiated pleasantly upon the old nobleman's wrathful protests. The next morning, another newspaper published an interview with Arsène Lupin, which was supposed to have taken place in a lobby at the Opera. Arsène Lupin retorted in a letter to the editor: "I share my prospective father-in-law's indignation to the full. The sending out of the invitations was a gross breach of etiquette for which I am not responsible, but for which I wish to make a public apology. Why, sir, the date of the marriage is not yet fixed. My bride's father suggests early in May. She and I think that 6 weeks is really too long to wait." That which gave a special piquancy to the affair, and added immensely to the enjoyment of the friends of the family, was the duke's well-known character, his pride and the uncompromising nature of his ideas and principles. Duc Jean was the last descendant of the Baron de Sarzeau, the most ancient family in Brittany. He was the lineal descendant of that Sarzeau who, upon marrying a Vendôme, refused to bear the new title which Louis XV forced upon him, until after he had been imprisoned for 10 years in the Bastille, and he had abandoned none of the prejudices of the old régime. In his youth, he followed the Comte de Chambord into exile. In his old age, he refused a seat in the Chamber on the pretext that a Sarzeau could only sit with his peers. The incident stung him to the quick. Nothing could pacify him. He cursed Lupin in good round terms, threatened him with every sort of punishment, and rounded on his daughter. "There, if you had only married! After all, you had plenty of chances. Your 3 cousins, Mussy, d'Amboise and Caorches, are noblemen of good descent, allied to the best families, fairly well off, and they are still anxious to marry you. Why do you refuse them? Ah, because Miss is a dreamer, a sentimentalist, and because her cousins are too fat, or too thin, or too coarse for her." She was, in fact, a dreamer. Left to her own devices from childhood, she had read all the books of chivalry, all the colourless romances of olden time that littered the ancestral presses; and she looked upon life as a fairy tale in which the beauteous maidens are always happy, while the others wait till death for the bridegroom which does not come. Why should she marry one of her cousins when they were only after her money, the millions which she had inherited from her mother? She might as well remain an old maid and go on dreaming. She answered gently: "You will end by making yourself ill, father. Forget this silly business." But how could he forget? Every morning some pin-prick renewed his wound. 3 days running, Angélique received a wonderful sheaf of flowers, with Arsène Lupin's card peeping from it. The duke could not go to his club but a friend accosted him: "That was a good one to day." "What was?" "Why, your son-in-law's latest. Haven't you seen it? Here, read it for yourself. Monsieur Arsène Lupin is petitioning the Council of State for permission to add his wife's name to his own and to be known henceforth as Lupin de Sarzeau-Vendôme." And the next day he read: "As the young bride, by virtue of an unrepealed decree of Charles X, bears the title and arms of the Bourbon Condés, of whom she is the heiress of line, the eldest son of the Lupin de Sarzeau-Vendôme will be styled Prince de Bourbon Condé." And the day after, an advertisement: "Exhibition of Mademoiselle de Sarzeau-Vendôme's trousseau at Messieurs' Great Linen Warehouse." Each article marked with initials L.S.V. Then an illustrated paper published a photographic scene: the duke, his daughter and his son-in-law sitting at a table playing three-handed auction bridge. And the date also was announced with a great flourish of trumpets: the 4th of May. And particulars were given of the marriage settlement. Lupin showed himself wonderfully disinterested. He was prepared to sign, the newspapers said, with his eyes closed, without knowing the figure of the dowry. All these things drove the old duke crazy. His hatred of Lupin assumed morbid proportions. Much as it went against the grain, he called on the prefect of police, who advised him to be on his guard: "We know the gentleman's ways. He is employing one of his favourite dodges. Forgive the expression, Monsieur le Duc, but he is nursing you. Don't fall into the trap." "What dodge? What trap?" asked the duke anxiously. "He is trying to make you lose your head and to lead you, by intimidation, to do something which you would refuse to do in cold blood." "Still, M. Arsène Lupin can hardly hope that I will offer him my daughter's hand." "No, but he hopes that you will commit, to put it mildly, a blunder." "What blunder?" "Exactly that blunder which he wants you to commit." "Then you think, Monsieur le Préfet?" "I think the best thing you can do, Monsieur le Duc, is to go home, or, if all this excitement worries you, to run down to the country and stay there quietly, without upsetting yourself." This conversation only increased the old duke's fears. Lupin appeared to him in the light of a terrible person, who employed diabolical methods and kept accomplices in every sphere of society. Prudence was the watchword. And life, from that moment, became intolerable. The duke grew more crabbed and silent than ever, and denied his door to all his old friends and even to Angélique's 3 suitors, her cousins de Mussy, d'Amboise and de Caorches, who were none of them on speaking terms with the others, in consequence of their rivalry, and who were in the habit of calling, turn and turn about, every week. For no earthly reason, he dismissed his butler and his coachman; but he dared not fill their places, for fear of engaging creatures of Arsène Lupin's; and his own man, Hyacinthe, in whom he had every confidence, having had him in his service for over 40 years, had to take upon himself the laborious duties of the stables and the pantry. "Come, father," said Angélique, trying to make him listen to common sense, "I really can't see what you are afraid of. No one can force me into this ridiculous marriage." "Well, of course, that's not what I'm afraid of." "What then, father?" "How can I tell? An abduction, a burglary, an act of violence. There is no doubt that the villain is scheming something, and there is also no doubt that we are surrounded by spies." One afternoon, he received a newspaper in which the following paragraph was marked in red pencil: "The signing of the marriage contract is fixed for this evening, at the Sarzeau-Vendôme town house. It will be quite a private ceremony, and only a few privileged friends will be present to congratulate the happy pair. The witnesses to the contract, on behalf of Mademoiselle de Sarzeau-Vendôme, the Prince de la Rochefoucauld-Limours and the Comte de Chartres, will be introduced by Monsieur Arsène Lupin to the 2 gentlemen who have claimed the honour of acting as his groomsmen, namely, the prefect of police and the governor of the Santé prison." 10 minutes later, the duke sent his servant Hyacinthe to the post with 3 express messages. At 4 o'clock, in Angélique's presence, he saw the 3 cousins: Mussy, fat, heavy, pasty-faced; d'Emboise, slender, fresh-coloured and shy; Caorches, short, thin and unhealthy-looking: all 3, old bachelors by this time, lacking distinction in dress or appearance. The meeting was a short one. The duke had worked out his whole plan of campaign, a defensive campaign, of which he set forth the first stage in explicit terms. "Angélique and I will leave Paris to night for our place in Brittany. I rely on you, my 3 nephews, to help us get away. You, d'Emboise, will come and fetch us in your car, with the hood up. You, Mussy, will bring your big motor and kindly see to the luggage with Hyacinthe, my man. You, Caorches, will go to the Gare d'Orléans and book our berths in the sleeping car for Vannes by the 10:40 train. Is that settled?" The rest of the day passed without incident. The duke, to avoid any accidental indiscretion, waited until after dinner to tell Hyacinthe to pack a trunk and a portmanteau. Hyacinthe was to accompany them, as well as Angélique's maid. At 9 o'clock, all the other servants went to bed, by their master's order. At 10 minutes to 10, the duke, who was completing his preparations, heard the sound of a motor horn. The porter opened the gates of the courtyard. The duke, standing at the window, recognized d'Emboise's landaulet. "Tell him I shall be down presently," he said to Hyacinthe, "and let mademoiselle know." In a few minutes, as Hyacinthe did not return, he left his room. But he was attacked on the landing by 2 masked men, who gagged and bound him before he could utter a cry. And one of the men said to him, in a low voice: "Take this as a first warning, Monsieur le Duc. If you persist in leaving Paris and refusing your consent, it will be a more serious matter." And the same man said to his companion: "Keep an eye on him. I will see to the young lady." By that time, 2 other confederates had secured the lady's maid, and Angélique, herself gagged, lay fainting on a couch in her boudoir. She came to almost immediately, under the stimulus of a bottle of salts held to her nostrils; and, when she opened her eyes, she saw bending over her a young man, in evening clothes, with a smiling and friendly face, who said: "I implore your forgiveness, mademoiselle. All these happenings are a trifle sudden, and this behaviour rather out of the way. But circumstances often compel us to deeds of which our conscience does not approve. Pray pardon me." He took her hand very gently and slipped a broad gold ring on the girl's finger, saying: "There, now we are engaged. Never forget the man who gave you this ring. He entreats you not to run away from him, and to stay in Paris and await the proofs of his devotion. Have faith in him." He said all this in so serious and respectful a voice, with so much authority and deference, that she had not the strength to resist. Their eyes met. He whispered: "The exquisite purity of your eyes! It would be heavenly to live with those eyes upon one. Now close them." He withdrew. His accomplices followed suit. The car drove off, and the house in the Rue de Varennes remained still and silent until the moment when Angélique, regaining complete consciousness, called out for the servants. They found the duke, Hyacinthe, the lady's maid and the porter and his wife all tightly bound. A few priceless ornaments had disappeared, as well as the duke's pocket book and all his jewellery, tie pins, pearl studs, watch and so on. The police were advised without delay. In the morning it appeared that, on the evening before, d'Emboise, when leaving his house in the motor car, was stabbed by his own chauffeur and thrown, half dead, into a deserted street. Mussy and Caorches had each received a telephone message, purporting to come from the duke, countermanding their attendance. Next week, without troubling further about the police investigation, without obeying the summons of the examining magistrate, without even reading Arsène Lupin's letters to the papers on the Varennes flight, the duke, his daughter and his valet stealthily took a slow train for Vannes and arrived one evening at the old feudal castle that towers over the headland of Sarzeau. The duke at once organized a defence with the aid of the Breton peasants, true mediæval vassals to a man. On the 4th day, Mussy arrived, on the 5th, Caorches, and on the 7th, d'Emboise, whose wound was not as severe as had been feared. The duke waited 2 days longer before communicating to those about him what, now that his escape had succeeded in spite of Lupin, he called the second part of his plan. He did so, in the presence of the 3 cousins, by a dictatorial order to Angélique, expressed in these peremptory terms: "All this bother is upsetting me terribly. I have entered on a struggle with this man whose daring you have seen for yourself; and the struggle is killing me. I want to end it at all costs. There is only one way of doing so, Angélique, and that is for you to release me from all responsibility by accepting the hand of one of your cousins. Before a month is out, you must be the wife of Mussy, Caorches, or d'Emboise. You have a free choice. Make your decision." For 4 whole days Angélique wept and entreated her father, but in vain. She felt that he would be inflexible and that she must end by submitting to his wishes. She accepted: "Whichever you please, father. I love none of them, so I may as well be unhappy with one as with the other." Thereupon a fresh discussion ensued, as the duke wanted to compel her to make her own choice. She stood firm. Reluctantly and for financial considerations, he named d'Emboise. The bans were published without delay. From that moment, the watch in and around the castle was increased twofold, all the more inasmuch as Lupin's silence and the sudden cessation of the campaign which he had been conducting in the press could not but alarm the Duc de Sarzeau-Vendôme. It was obvious that the enemy was getting ready to strike and would endeavour to oppose the marriage by one of his characteristic moves. Nevertheless, nothing happened. Nothing 2 days before the ceremony, nothing on the day before, nothing on the morning itself. The marriage took place in the mayor's office, followed by the religious celebration in church, and the thing was done. Then, and not till then, the duke breathed freely. Notwithstanding his daughter's sadness, notwithstanding the embarrassed silence of his son-in-law, who found the situation a little trying, he rubbed his hands with an air of pleasure, as though he had achieved a brilliant victory. "Tell them to lower the drawbridge," he said to Hyacinthe, "and to admit everybody. We have nothing more to fear from that scoundrel." After the wedding breakfast, he had wine served out to the peasants and clinked glasses with them. They danced and sang. At 3 o'clock, he returned to the ground-floor rooms. It was the hour for his afternoon nap. He walked to the guard-room at the end of the suite. But he had no sooner placed his foot on the threshold than he stopped suddenly and exclaimed: "What are you doing here, d'Emboise? Is this a joke?" D'Emboise was standing before him, dressed as a Breton fisherman, in a dirty jacket and breeches, torn, patched and many sizes too large for him. The duke seemed dumbfounded. He stared with eyes of amazement at that face which he knew and which, at the same time, roused memories of a very distant past within his brain. Then he strode abruptly to one of the windows overlooking the castle terrace and called: "Angélique!" "What is it, father?" she asked, coming forward. "Where's your husband?" "Over there, father," said Angélique, pointing to d'Emboise, who was smoking a cigarette and reading, some way off. The duke stumbled and fell into a chair, with a great shudder of fright. "Oh, I shall go mad!" But the man in the fisherman's garb knelt down before him and said: "Look at me, uncle. You know me, don't you? I'm your nephew, the one who used to play here in the old days, the one whom you called Jacquot. Just think a minute. Here, look at this scar." Yes," stammered the duke. I recognize you. It's Jacques. But the other one." He put his hands to his head. "And yet... no, it can't be. Explain yourself. I don't understand. I don't want to understand." There was a pause, during which the newcomer shut the window and closed the door leading to the next room. Then he came up to the old duke, touched him gently on the shoulder, to wake him from his torpor, and without further preface, as though to cut short any explanation that was not absolutely necessary, spoke as follows: "4 years ago, that is to say, in the 11th year of my voluntary exile, when I settled in the extreme south of Algeria, I made the acquaintance, in the course of a hunting expedition arranged by a big Arab chief, of a man whose geniality, whose charm of manner, whose consummate prowess, whose indomitable pluck, whose combined humour and depth of mind fascinated me in the highest degree. The Comte d'Andrésy spent 6 weeks as my guest. After he left, we kept up a correspondence at regular intervals. I also often saw his name in the papers, in the society and sporting columns. He was to come back and I was preparing to receive him, 3 months ago, when one evening as I was out riding, my 2 Arab attendants flung themselves upon me, bound me, blindfolded me, and took me, travelling day and night for a week, along deserted roads, to a bay on the coast, where 5 men awaited them. I was at once carried on board a small steam yacht, which weighed anchor without delay. There was nothing to tell me who the men were nor what their object was in kidnapping me. They had locked me into a narrow cabin, secured by a massive door and lighted by a porthole protected by 2 iron crossbars. Every morning, a hand was inserted through a hatch between the next cabin and my own and placed on my bunk 2 or 3 pounds of bread, a good helping of food and a flagon of wine, and removed the remains of yesterday's meals, which I put there for the purpose. From time to time, at night, the yacht stopped and I heard the sound of the boat rowing to some harbour and then returning, doubtless with provisions. Then we set out once more, without hurrying, as though on a cruise of people of our class, who travel for pleasure and are not pressed for time. Sometimes, standing on a chair, I would see the coastline through my porthole, too indistinctly, however, to locate it. And this lasted for weeks. One morning, in the 9th week, I perceived that the hatch had been left unfastened and I pushed it open. The cabin was empty at the time. With an effort, I was able to take a nail file from a dressing table. 2 weeks after that, by dint of patient perseverance, I had succeeded in filing through the bars of my porthole and I could have escaped that way, only, though I am a good swimmer, I soon grow tired. I had therefore to choose a moment when the yacht was not too far from the land. It was not until yesterday that, perched on my chair, I caught sight of the coast, and in the evening, at sunset, I recognized to my astonishment the outlines of the Château de Sarzeau, with its pointed turrets and its square keep. I wondered if this was the goal of my mysterious voyage. All night long we cruised in the offing; the same all day yesterday. At last, this morning, we put in at a distance which I considered favourable, all the more so as we were steaming through rocks under cover of which I could swim unobserved. But just as I was about to make my escape, I noticed that the shutter of the hatch, which they thought they had closed, had once more opened of itself and was flapping against the partition. I again pushed it ajar from curiosity. Within arm's length was a little cupboard which I managed to open and in which my hand, groping at random, laid hold of a bundle of papers. This consisted of letters containing instructions addressed to the pirates who held me prisoner. An hour later, when I wriggled through the porthole and slipped into the sea, I knew all: the reasons for my abduction, the means employed, the object in view and the infamous scheme plotted during the last 3 months against the Duc de Sarzeau Vendôme and his daughter. Unfortunately, it was too late. I was obliged, in order not to be seen from the yacht, to crouch in the cleft of a rock, and did not reach land until midday. By the time that I had been to a fisherman's cabin, exchanged my clothes for his and come on here, it was 3 o'clock. On my arrival, I learned that Angélique's marriage was celebrated this morning. Chapter 8, Part 1. Chapter 8, Part 2 of The Confessions of Arsène Lupin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Confessions of Arsène Lupin, by Maurice LeBlanc. Chapter 8. Lupin's marriage. The old duke had not spoken a word. With his eyes riveted on the strangers, he was listening in ever-increasing dismay. At times, the thought of the warnings given him by the prefect of police returned to his mind. "They're nursing you, Monsieur le Duc, they are nursing you." He said in a hollow voice: "Speak on. Finish your story. All this is ghastly. I don't understand it yet. And I feel nervous." The stranger resumed: "I am sorry to say, the story is easily pieced together and is summed up in a few sentences. It is like this: the Comte d'Andrésy remembered several things from his stay with me and from the confidences which I was foolish enough to make to him. First of all, I was your nephew, and yet you had seen comparatively little of me, because I left Sarzeau when I was quite a child, and since then our intercourse was limited to the few weeks which I spent here, 15 years ago, when I proposed for the hand of my cousin Angélique. Secondly, having broken with the past, I received no letters. Lastly, there was a certain physical resemblance between d'Andrésy and myself which could be accentuated to such an extent as to become striking. His scheme was built up on those 3 points. He bribed my Arab servants to give him warning in case I left Algeria. Then he went back to Paris, bearing my name and made up to look exactly like me, came to see you, was invited to your house once a fortnight, and lived under my name, which thus became one of the many aliases beneath which he conceals his real identity. 3 months ago, when the apple was ripe, as he says in his letters, he began the attack by a series of communications to the press, and, at the same time, fearing no doubt that some newspaper would tell me in Algeria the part that was being played under my name in Paris, he had me assaulted by my servants and kidnapped by his confederates. I need not explain any more in so far as you are concerned, uncle." The Duc de Sarzeau-Vendôme was shaking with a fit of nervous trembling. The awful truth to which he refused to open his eyes appeared to him in its nakedness and assumed the hateful countenance of the enemy. He clutched his nephew's hands and said to him fiercely, despairingly: "It's Lupin, is it not?" "Yes, uncle." "And it's to him that I have given my daughter?" "Yes, uncle, to him, who has stolen my name of Jacques d'Emboise from me and stolen your daughter from you. Angélique is the wedded wife of Arsène Lupin. And that in accordance with your orders. This letter in his handwriting bears witness to it. He has upset your whole life, thrown you off your balance, besieging your hours of waking and your nights of dreaming, rifling your town house, until the moment when, seized with terror, you took refuge here, where, thinking that you would escape his artifices and his rapacity, you told your daughter to choose one of her 3 cousins, Mussy, d'Emboise or Caorches, as her husband." "But why did she select that one rather than the others?" "It was you who selected him, uncle." "At random, because he had the biggest income?" "No, not at random, but on the insidious, persistent and very clever advice of your servant Hyacinthe." The duke gave a start. "What! Is Hyacinthe an accomplice?" "No, not of Arsène Lupin, but of the man whom he believes to be d'Emboise and who promised to give him 100,000 francs within a week after the marriage." "Oh, the villain! He planned everything, foresaw everything." "Foresaw everything, uncle, down to shamming an attempt upon his life so as to avert suspicion, down to shamming a wound received in your service." "But with what object? Why all these dastardly tricks?" "Angélique has a fortune of 11 million francs. Your solicitor in Paris was to hand the securities next week to the counterfeit d'Emboise, who had only to realize them forthwith and disappear. But this very morning you yourself were to hand your son-in-law, as a personal wedding present, 500,000 francs worth of bearer stock, which he has arranged to deliver to one of his accomplices at 9 o'clock this evening, outside the castle, near the Great Oak, so that they may be negotiated to-morrow morning in Brussels." The Duc de Sarzeau-Vendôme had risen from his seat and was stamping furiously up and down the room. "At 9 o'clock this evening?" he said. "We'll see about that. We'll see about that. I'll have the gendarmes here before then." "Arsène Lupin laughs at gendarmes." "Let's telegraph to Paris." "Yes, but how about the 500,000 francs? And still worse, uncle, the scandal. Think of this: your daughter, Angélique de Sarzeau-Vendôme, married to that swindler, that thief. No, it would never do." "What then?" "What?" The nephew now rose and, stepping to a gun-rack, took down a rifle and laid it on the table, in front of the duke. "Away in Algeria, uncle, on the verge of the desert, when we find ourselves face to face with a wild beast, we do not send for the gendarmes. We take our rifle and we shoot the wild beast. Otherwise, the beast would tear us to pieces with its claws." "What do you mean?" "I mean that over there I acquired the habit of dispensing with the gendarmes. It is a rather summary way of doing justice, but it is the best way, believe me, and to-day, in the present case, it is the only way. Once the beast is killed, you and I will bury it in some corner, unseen and unknown." "And Angélique?" "We will tell her later." "What will become of her?" "She will be my wife, the wife of the real d'Emboise. I desert her to-morrow and return to Algeria. The divorce will be granted in 2 months' time." The duke listened, pale and staring, with set jaws. He whispered: "Are you sure that his accomplices on the yacht will not inform him of your escape?" "Not before to-morrow." "So that inevitably, at 9 o'clock this evening, Arsène Lupin, on his way to the Great Oak, will take the patrol path that follows the old ramparts and skirts the ruins of the chapel. I shall be there, in the ruins." "I shall be there too," said the Duc de Sarzeau-Vendôme, quietly, taking down a gun. It was now 5 o'clock. The duke talked some time longer to his nephew, examined the weapons, loaded them with fresh cartridges. Then, when night came, he took d'Emboise through the dark passages to his bedroom and hid him in an adjoining closet. Nothing further happened until dinner. The duke forced himself to keep calm during the meal. From time to time, he stole a glance at his son-in-law and was surprised at the likeness between him and the real d'Emboise. It was the same complexion, the same cast of features, the same cut of hair. Nevertheless, the look of the eye was different, keener in this case and brighter. And gradually the duke discovered minor details which had passed unperceived till then and which proved the fellow's imposture. The party broke up after dinner. It was 8 o'clock. The duke went to his room and released his nephew. 10 minutes later, under cover of the darkness, they slipped into the ruins, gun in hand. Meanwhile, Angélique, accompanied by her husband, had gone to the suite of rooms which she occupied on the ground floor of a tower that flanked the left wing. Her husband stopped at the entrance to the rooms and said: "I'm going for a short stroll, Angélique. May I come to you here when I return?" "Yes," she replied. He left her and went up to the first floor, which had been assigned to him as his quarters. The moment he was alone, he locked the door, noiselessly opened a window that looked over the landscape and leant out. He saw a shadow at the foot of the tower, some 100 feet or more below him. He whistled and received a faint whistle in reply. He then took from a cupboard a thick leather satchel, crammed with papers, wrapped it in a piece of black cloth and tied it up. Then he sat down at the table and wrote: "Glad you got my message, for I think it unsafe to walk out of the castle with that large bundle of securities. Here they are. You will be in Paris on your motor-cycle in time to catch the morning train to Brussels, where you will hand over the bonds to Z., and he will negotiate them at once. P.S. As you pass by the Great Oak, tell our chaps that I'm coming. I have some instructions to give them. But everything is going well. No one here has the least suspicion." He fastened the letter to the parcel and lowered both through the window with a length of string. "Good," he said. "That's all right. It's a weight off my mind." He waited a few minutes longer, stalking up and down the room and smiling at the portraits of 2 gallant gentlemen hanging on the wall. "Horace de Sarzeau-Vendôme, Marshal of France, and you, the great Condé, I salute you, my ancestors both. Lupin de Sarzeau-Vendôme will show himself worthy of you." At last, when the time came, he took his hat and went down. But when he reached the ground floor, Angélique burst from her rooms and exclaimed, with a distraught air: "I say, if you don't mind, I think you had better..." And then, without saying more, she went in again, leaving a vision of irresponsible terror in her husband's mind. "She's out of sorts," he said to himself. "Marriage doesn't suit her." He lit a cigarette and went out, without attaching importance to an incident that ought to have impressed him. Poor Angélique, this will all end in a divorce. The night outside was dark, with a cloudy sky. The servants were closing the shutters of the castle. There was no light in the windows, it being the duke's habit to go to bed soon after dinner. Lupin passed the gatekeeper's lodge and, as he put his foot on the drawbridge, said: "Leave the gate open. I am going for a breath of air. I shall be back soon." The patrol path was on the right and ran along one of the old ramparts, which used to surround the castle with a second and much larger enclosure, until it ended at an almost demolished postern gate. The park, which skirted a hillock and afterward followed the side of a deep valley, was bordered on the left by thick coppices. "What a wonderful place for an ambush!" he said. "A regular cut-throat spot." He stopped, thinking that he heard a noise. But no, it was a rustling of the leaves. And yet a stone went rattling down the slopes, bounding against the rugged projections of the rock. But, strange to say, nothing seemed to disquiet him. The crisp sea breeze came blowing over the plains of the headland, and he eagerly filled his lungs with it. "What a thing it is to be alive!" he thought. "Still young, a member of the old nobility, a multi-millionaire. What could a man want more?" At a short distance, he saw against the darkness the yet darker outline of the chapel, the ruins of which towered above the path. A few drops of rain began to fall, and he heard a clock strike 9. He quickened his pace. There was a short descent, then the path rose again. And suddenly he stopped once more. A hand had seized his. He drew back, tried to release himself. But some one stepped from the clump of trees against which he was brushing, and a voice said: "Ssh! Not a word." He recognized his wife, Angélique. "What's the matter?" he asked. She whispered, so low that he could hardly catch the words:
"They are lying in wait for you. They're in there, in the ruins, with their guns."
"Who?"
"Keep quiet. Listen."
They stood for a moment without stirring, then she said: "They're not moving. Perhaps they never heard me. Let's go back." "But..."
"Come with me."
Her accent was so imperious that he obeyed without further question. But suddenly she took fright.
"Run! They are coming! I'm sure of it!"
True enough, they heard a sound of footsteps. Then, swiftly, still holding him by the hand, she dragged him, with irresistible energy, along a short cut, following its turns without hesitation in spite of the darkness and the brambles; and they very soon arrived at the drawbridge. She put her arm in his. The gatekeeper touched his cap. They crossed the courtyard and entered the castle; and she led him to the corner tower in which both of them had their apartments. "Come in here," she said.
"To your rooms?"
"Yes." Two maids were sitting up for her. Their mistress ordered them to retire to their rooms, on the third floor. Almost immediately after, there was a knock at the door of the outer room; and a voice called: "Angélique!" "Is that you, father?" she asked, suppressing her agitation. "Yes. Is your husband here?" "We have just come in." "Tell him I want to speak to him. Ask him to come to my room. It's important." "Very well, father, I'll send him to you." She listened for a few seconds, then returned to the boudoir where her husband was and said: "I'm sure my father is still there." He moved as though to go out. "In that case, if he wants to speak to me...." "My father is not alone," she said, quickly, blocking his way. "Who is with him?" "His nephew, Jacques d'Emboise." There was a moment's silence. He looked at her with a certain astonishment, failing quite to understand his wife's attitude. But without pausing to go into the matter: "Ah, so that dear old d'Emboise is there?" he chuckled. "Then the fat's in the fire? Unless, indeed...." "My father knows everything," she said. "I overheard a conversation between them just now. His nephew has read certain letters. I hesitated at first about telling you. Then I thought it my duty." He studied her afresh. But, at once conquered by the queerness of the situation, he burst out laughing: "What! Don't my friends on board ship burn my letters? And they have let their prisoner escape? The idiots! Oh, and you don't see to everything yourself! No matter, it's distinctly humorous. D'Emboise versus d'Emboise. Oh, but suppose I were no longer recognized? Suppose d'Emboise himself were to confuse me with himself?" He turned to a wash-hand stand, took a towel, dipped it in the basin and soaped it and, in the twinkling of an eye, wiped the make-up from his face and altered the set of his hair. "That's it," he said, showing himself to Angélique under the aspect in which she had seen him on the night of the burglary in Paris. "I feel more comfortable like this for a discussion with my father-in-law." "Where are you going?" she cried, flinging herself in front of the door. "Why, to join the gentlemen." "You shall not pass." "Why not?" "Suppose they kill you?" "Kill me?" "That's what they mean to do, to kill you, to hide your body somewhere. Who would know of it?" "Very well," he said. "From their point of view, they are quite right. But if I don't go to them, they will come here. That door won't stop them. Nor you, I'm thinking. Therefore, it's better to have done with it." "Follow me," commanded Angélique. She took up the lamp that lit the room, went into her bedroom, pushed aside the wardrobe, which slid easily on hidden castors, pulled back an old tapestry hanging and said: "Here is a door that has not been used for years. My father believes the key to be lost. I have it here. Unlock the door with it. A staircase in the wall will take you to the bottom of the tower. You need only draw the bolts of another door and you will be free." He could hardly believe his ears. Suddenly, he grasped the meaning of Angélique's whole behaviour. In front of that sad, plain, but wonderfully gentle face, he stood for a moment discountenanced, almost abashed. He no longer thought of laughing. A feeling of respect, mingled with remorse and kindness, overcame him. "Why are you saving me?" he whispered. "You are my husband." He protested: "No, no, I have stolen that title. The law will never recognize my marriage." "My father does not want a scandal," she said. "Just so," he replied, sharply, "just so. I foresaw that; and that was why I had your cousin d'Emboise near at hand. Once I disappear, he becomes your husband. He is the man you have married in the eyes of men. You are the man I have married in the eyes of the Church." "The Church! The Church! There are means of arranging matters with the Church. Your marriage can be annulled." "On what pretext that we can admit?" He remained silent, thinking over all those points which he had not considered, all those points which were trivial and absurd for him, but which were serious for her, and he repeated several times: "Oh, this is terrible! This is terrible! I should have anticipated." And suddenly, seized with an idea, he clapped his hands and cried: "There, I have it! I'm hand in glove with one of the chief figures at the Vatican. The Pope never refuses me anything. I shall obtain an audience, and I have no doubt that the Holy Father, moved by my entreaties—" His plan was so humorous and his delight so artless that Angélique could not help smiling, and she said: "I am your wife in the eyes of God." She gave him a look that showed neither scorn nor animosity, nor even anger; and he realized that she omitted to see in him the outlaw and the evildoer and remembered only the man who was her husband and to whom the priest had bound her until the hour of death. He took a step toward her and observed her more attentively. She did not lower her eyes at first, but she blushed. And never had he seen so pathetic a face, marked with such modesty and such dignity. He said to her, as on that first evening in Paris: "Oh, your eyes! The calm and sadness of your eyes! The beauty of your eyes!" She dropped her head and stammered: Go away, go." In the presence of her confusion, he received a quick intuition of the deeper feelings that stirred her, unknown to herself. To that spinster soul, of which he recognized the romantic power of imagination, the unsatisfied yearnings, the poring over old world books, he suddenly represented, in that exceptional moment and in consequence of the unconventional circumstances of their meetings, somebody special, a Byronic hero, a chivalrous brigand of romance. One evening, in spite of all obstacles, he, the world-famed adventurer, already ennobled in song and story and exalted by his own audacity, had come to her and slipped the magic ring upon her finger: a mystic and passionate betrothal, as in the days of Corsair and Hernani. Greatly moved and touched, he was on the verge of giving way to an enthusiastic impulse and exclaiming: "Let us go away together! Let us fly! You are my bride, my wife! Share my dangers, my sorrows and my joys. It will be a strange and vigorous, a proud and magnificent life." But Angélique's eyes were raised to his again; and they were so pure and so noble that he blushed in his turn. This was not the woman to whom such words could be addressed. He whispered: "Forgive me. I'm a contemptible wretch. I have wrecked your life." "No," she replied softly. "On the contrary, you have shown me where my real life lies." He was about to ask her to explain; but she had opened the door and was pointing the way to him. Nothing more could be spoken between them. He went out without a word, bowing very low as he passed. A month later, Angélique de Sarzeau-Vendôme, Princesse de Bourbon-Condé, lawful wife of Arsène Lupin, took the veil and, under the name of Sister Marie Auguste, buried herself within the walls of the Visitation Convent. On the day of the ceremony, the Mother Superior of the convent received a heavy sealed envelope containing a letter with the following words: "For Sister Marie Auguste's poor." Enclosed with the letter were 500 banknotes of 1,000 francs each. Chapter 9 of the Confessions of Arsène Lupin. This recording is in the public domain. The Confessions of Arsène Lupin, by Maurice LeBlanc. Chapter 9: The Invisible Prisoner. One day, at about 4 o'clock, as evening was drawing in, Farmer Goussot, with his 4 sons, returned from a day's shooting. They were stalwart men, all 5 of them, long of limb, broad-chested, with faces tanned by sun and wind. And all 5 displayed, planted on an enormous neck and shoulders, the same small head with the low forehead, thin lips, beaked nose and hard and repellent cast of countenance. They were feared and disliked by all around them. They were a money-grubbing, crafty family, and their word was not to be trusted. On reaching the old barbican wall that surrounds the Héberville property, the farmer opened a narrow, massive door, putting the big key back in his pocket after his sons had passed in; and he walked behind them, along the path that led through the orchards. Here and there stood great trees, stripped by the autumn winds, and clumps of pines, the last survivors of the ancient park now covered by old Goussot's farm. One of the sons said: "I hope mother has lit a log or two." "There's smoke coming from the chimney," said the father. The outhouses and the homestead showed at the end of a lawn; and above them the village church, whose steeple seemed to prick the clouds that trailed along the sky. "All the guns unloaded?" asked old Goussot. "Mine isn't," said the eldest. "I slipped in a bullet to blow a kestrel's head off." He was the one who was proudest of his skill; and he said to his brothers: "Look at that bough at the top of the cherry tree. See me snap it off." On the bough sat a scarecrow, which had been there since spring and which protected the leafless branches with its idiot arms. He raised his gun and fired. The figure came tumbling down with large, comic gestures, and was caught on a big lower branch, where it remained lying stiff on its stomach, with a great top hat on its head of rags, and its hay-stuffed legs swaying from right to left above some water that flowed past the cherry tree through a wooden trough. They all laughed. The father approved. "A fine shot, my lad. Besides, the old boy was beginning to annoy me. I couldn't take my eyes from my plate at meals without catching sight of that oaf." They went a few steps farther. They were not more than 30 yards from the house when the father stopped suddenly and said: "Hullo! What's up?" The sons also had stopped and stood listening. One of them said, under his breath: "It comes from the house, from the linen room." And another spluttered: "It sounds like moans. And mother's alone." Suddenly a frightful scream rang out. All 5 rushed forward. Another scream, followed by cries of despair. "We're here! We're coming!" shouted the eldest, who was leading. And as it was a roundabout way to the door, he smashed in a window with his fist and sprang into the old people's bedroom. The room next to it was the linen room, in which Mother Goussot spent most of her time. "Damnation!" he said, seeing her lying on the floor, with blood all over her face. "Dad! Dad!" "What? Where is she?" roared old Goussot, appearing on the scene. "Good Lord, what's this? What have they done to your mother?" She pulled herself together and, with outstretched arm, stammered: "Run after him! This way! This way! I'm all right, only a scratch or two. But run, you! He's taken the money!" The father and sons gave a bound. "He's taken the money!" bellowed old Goussot, rushing to the door to which his wife was pointing. "He's taken the money! Stop thief!" But a sound of several voices rose at the end of the passage through which the other 3 sons were coming. "I saw him! I saw him!" "So did I. He ran up the stairs." "No, there he is. He's coming down again." A mad steeplechase shook every floor in the house. Farmer Goussot, on reaching the end of the passage, caught sight of a man standing by the front door, trying to open it. If he succeeded, it meant safety, escape through the market square and the back lanes of the village. Interrupted as he was fumbling at the bolts, the man, turning stupid, lost his head, charged at old Goussot and sent him spinning, dodged the eldest brother and, pursued by the 4 sons, doubled back down the long passage, ran into the old couple's bedroom, flung his legs through the broken window and disappeared. The sons rushed after him across the lawns and orchards, now darkened by the falling night. "The villain's done for," chuckled old Goussot. "There's no way out for him. The walls are too high. He's done for, the scoundrel." The 2 farm hands returned, at that moment, from the village, and he told them what had happened and gave each of them a gun. "If the swine shows his nose anywhere near the house," he said, "let fly at him. Give him no mercy." He told them where to stand, went to make sure that the farm gates, which were only used for the carts, were locked, and not till then remembered that his wife might perhaps be in need of aid. "Well, mother, how goes it?" "Where is he? Have you got him?" she asked, in a breath. "Yes, we're after him. The lads must have collared him by now." The news quite restored her, and a nip of rum gave her the strength to drag herself to the bed, with old Goussot's assistance, and to tell her story. For that matter, there was not much to tell. She had just lit the fire in the living hall; and she was knitting quietly at her bedroom window, waiting for the men to return, when she thought that she heard a slight grating sound in the linen room next door. "I must have left the cat in there," she thought to herself. She went in, suspecting nothing, and was astonished to see the two doors of one of the linen cupboards, the one in which they hid their money, wide open. She walked up to it, still without suspicion. There was a man there, hiding, with his back to the shelves. "But how did he get in?" asked old Goussot. "Through the passage, I suppose. We never keep the back door shut." "And then did he go for you?" "No, I went for him. He tried to get away." "You should have let him." "And what about the money?" "Had he taken it by then?" "Had he taken it! I saw the bundle of bank notes in his hands, the sweep! I would have let him kill me sooner. Oh, we had a sharp tussle, I give you my word." "Then he had no weapon?" "No more than I did. We had our fingers, our nails and our teeth. Look here, where he bit me. And I yelled and screamed. Only I'm an old woman, you see. I had to let go of him." "Do you know the man?" "I'm pretty sure it was old Trainard." "The tramp?" "Why, of course, it's old Trainard!" cried the farmer. "I thought I knew him too. Besides, he's been hanging round the house these last 3 days. The old vagabond must have smelt the money. Aha, Trainard, my man, we shall see some fun! And number one hiding in the first place. And then the police. I say, mother, you can get up now, can't you? Then go and fetch the neighbours. Ask them to run for the gendarmes. By the by, the attorney's youngster has a bicycle. How that damned old Trainard scooted! He's got good legs for his age, he has. He can run like a hare." Goussot was holding his sides, revelling in the occurrence. He risked nothing by waiting. No power on earth could help the tramp escape, or keep him from the sound thrashing which he had earned and from being conveyed, under safe escort, to the town gaol. The farmer took a gun and went out to his 2 labourers. "Anything fresh?" "No, Farmer Goussot, not yet." "We shan't have long to wait. Unless old Nick carries him over the walls." From time to time, they heard the 4 brothers hailing one another in the distance. The old bird was evidently making a fight for it, was more active than they would have thought. Still, with sturdy fellows like the Goussot brothers. However, one of them returned, looking rather crestfallen, and made no secret of his opinion. "It's no use keeping on at it for the present. It's pitch dark. The old chap must have crept into some hole. We'll hunt him out to morrow." "To morrow? Why, lad, you're off your chump!" protested the farmer. The eldest son now appeared, quite out of breath, and was of the same opinion as his brother. Why not wait till next day, seeing that the ruffian was as safe within the demesne as between the walls of a prison? "Well, I'll go myself," cried old Goussot. "Light me a lantern, somebody." But at that moment 3 gendarmes arrived, and a number of village lads also came up to hear the latest. The sergeant of gendarmes was a man of method. He first insisted on hearing the whole story, in full detail. Then he stopped to think. Then he questioned the 4 brothers, separately, and took his time for reflection after each deposition. When he had learnt from them that the tramp had fled toward the back of the estate, that he had been lost sight of repeatedly and that he had finally disappeared near a place known as the Crow's Knoll, he meditated once more and announced his conclusion: "Better wait. Old Trainard might slip through our hands, amidst all the confusion of a pursuit in the dark, and then good night, everybody." The farmer shrugged his shoulders and, cursing under his breath, yielded to the sergeant's arguments. That worthy organized a strict watch, distributed the brothers Goussot and the lads from the village under his men's eyes, made sure that the ladders were locked away, and established his headquarters in the dining room, where he and Farmer Goussot sat and nodded over a decanter of old brandy. The night passed quietly. Every 2 hours, the sergeant went his rounds and inspected the posts. There were no alarms. Old Trainard did not budge from his hole. The battle began at break of day. It lasted 4 hours. In those 4 hours, the 13 acres of land within the walls were searched, explored, gone over in every direction by a score of men who beat the bushes with sticks, trampled over the tall grass, rummaged in the hollows of the trees and scattered the heaps of dry leaves. And old Trainard remained invisible. "Well, this is a bit thick," growled Goussot. "Beats me altogether," retorted the sergeant. And indeed there was no explaining the phenomenon. For, after all, apart from a few old clumps of laurels and spindle trees, which were thoroughly beaten, all the trees were bare. There was no hiding, there was no building, no shed, no stack, nothing, in short, that could serve as a hiding place. As for the wall, a careful inspection convinced even the sergeant that it was physically impossible to scale it. In the afternoon, the investigations were begun all over again in the presence of the examining magistrate and the public prosecutor's deputy. The results were no more successful. Nay, worse, the officials looked upon the matter as so suspicious that they could not restrain their ill humour and asked: "Are you quite sure, Farmer Goussot, that you and your sons haven't been seeing double?" "And what about my wife?" retorted the farmer, red with anger. "Did she see double when the scamp had her by the throat? Go and look at the marks, if you doubt me." "Very well. But then where is the scamp?" "Here, between those four walls." "Very well. Then ferret him out. We give it up. It's quite clear that if a man were hidden within the precincts of this farm, we should have found him by now." "I swear I'll lay hands on him, true as I stand here," shouted Farmer Goussot. "It shall not be said that I've been robbed of 6,000 francs. Yes, 6,000. There were 3 cows I sold, and then the wheat crop, and then the apples. 6,000-franc notes, which I was just going to take to the bank. Well, I swear to heaven that the money's as good as in my pocket." "That's all right, and I wish you luck," said the examining magistrate, as he went away, followed by the deputy and the gendarme. The neighbours also walked off in a more or less facetious mood; and by the end of the afternoon none remained but the Goussots and the 2 farm labourers. Old Goussot at once explained his plan. By day they were to search; at night they were to keep an incessant watch. It would last as long as it had to. Hang it, old Trainard was a man like other men, and men have to eat and drink. Old Trainard must needs, therefore, come out of his earth to eat and drink. "At most," said Goussot, "he can have a few crusts of bread in his pocket, or even pull up a root or 2 at night. But as far as drink's concerned, no go. There's only the spring, and he'll be a clever dog if he gets near that." He himself, that evening, took up his stand near the spring. 3 hours later, his eldest son relieved him. The other brothers and the farm hands slept in the house, each taking his turn of the watch, and keeping all the lamps and candles lit, so that there might be no surprise. So it went on for 14 consecutive nights; and for 14 days, while 2 of the men and Mother Goussot remained on guard, the 5 others explored the Héberville ground. At the end of that fortnight, not a sign. The farmer never ceased storming. He sent out for a retired detective-inspector who lived in the neighbouring town. The inspector stayed with him for a whole week. He found neither old Trainard nor the least clue that could give them any hope of finding old Trainard. "It's a bit thick," repeated Farmer Goussot. "For he's there, the rascal. As far as being anywhere goes, he's there. So—" Planting himself on the threshold, he railed at the enemy at the top of his voice: "You blithering idiot! Would you rather croak in your hole than fork out the money? Then croak, you pig!" And Mother Goussot, in her turn, yelped, in her shrill voice: "Is it prison you're afraid of? Hand over the notes and you can hook it." But old Trainard did not breathe a word; and the husband and wife tired their lungs in vain. Shocking days passed. Farmer Goussot could no longer sleep, lay shivering with fever. The sons became morose and quarrelsome and never let their guns out of their hands, having no other idea but to shoot the tramp. It was the one topic of conversation in the village; and the Goussot story, from being local at first, soon went the round of the press. Newspaper reporters came from the assize town, from Paris itself, and were rudely shown the door by Farmer Goussot. "Each man his own house," he said. "You mind your business, I mind mine. It's nothing to do with any one. Still, Farmer Goussot, go to blazes!" And he slammed the door in their face. Old Trainard had now been hidden within the walls of Héberville for something like 4 weeks. The Goussots continued their search as doggedly and confidently as ever, but with daily decreasing hope, as though they were confronted with one of those mysterious obstacles which discourage human effort; and the idea that they would never see their money again began to take root in them. One fine morning, at about 10 o'clock, a motor car, crossing the village square at full speed, broke down and came to a dead stop. The driver, after a careful inspection, declared that the repairs would take some little time, whereupon the owner of the car resolved to wait at the inn and lunch. He was a gentleman on the right side of 40, with close-cropped side-whiskers and a pleasant expression of face; and he soon made himself at home with the people at the inn. Of course they told him the story of the Goussots. He had not heard it before, as he had been abroad; but it seemed to interest him greatly. He made them give him all the details, raised objections, discussed various theories with a number of people who were eating at the same table, and ended by exclaiming: "Nonsense! It can't be so intricate as all that. I've had some experience of this sort of thing, and if I were on the premises—" "That's easily arranged," said the innkeeper. "I know Farmer Goussot. He won't object." The request was soon made and granted. Old Goussot was in one of those frames of mind when we are less disposed to protest against outside interference. His wife, at any rate, was very firm: "Let the gentleman come if he wants to." The gentleman paid his bill and instructed his driver to try the car on the high road as soon as the repairs were finished. "I shall want an hour," he said, "no more. Be ready in an hour's time." Then he went to Farmer Goussot's. He did not say much at the farm. Old Goussot, hoping against hope, was lavish with information, took his visitor along the walls down to the little door opening on the fields, produced the key and gave minute details of all the searches that had been made so far. Oddly enough, the stranger, who hardly spoke, seemed not to listen either. He merely looked, with a rather vacant gaze. When they had been round the estate, old Goussot asked anxiously: "Well?" "Well what?" "Do you think you know?" The visitor stood for a moment without answering. Then he said: "No, nothing." "Why, of course not!" cried the farmer, throwing up his arms. "How should you know? It's all hanky-panky. Shall I tell you what I think? Well, that old Trainard has been so jolly clever that he's lying dead in his hole; and the bank notes are rotting with him. Do you hear? You can take my word for it." The gentleman said, very calmly: "There's only one thing that interests me. The tramp, all said and done, was free at night and able to feed on what he could pick up. But how about drinking?" "Out of the question!" shouted the farmer. "Quite out of the question. There's no water except this, and we have kept watch beside it every night." "It's a spring. Where does it rise?" "Here, where we stand." "Is there enough pressure to bring it into the pool of itself?" "Yes." "And where does the water go when it runs out of the pool?" "Into this pipe here, which goes underground and carries it to the house, for use in the kitchen. So there's no way of drinking, seeing that we were there and that the spring is 20 yards from the house." "Hasn't it rained during the last 4 weeks?" "Not once. I've told you that already." The stranger went to the spring and examined it. The trough was formed of a few boards of wood joined together just above the ground, and the water ran through it, slow and clear. "The water's not more than a foot deep, is it?" he asked. In order to measure it, he picked up from the grass a straw which he dipped into the pool. But, as he was stooping, he suddenly broke off and looked around him. "Oh, how funny!" he said, bursting into a peal of laughter. "Why, what's the matter?" spluttered old Goussot, rushing toward the pool, as though a man could have lain hidden between those narrow boards. And Mother Goussot clasped her hands. "What is it? Have you seen him? Where is he?" "Neither in it nor under it," replied the stranger, who was still laughing. He made for the house, eagerly followed by the farmer, the old woman and the 4 sons. The innkeeper was there also, as were the people from the inn who had been watching the stranger's movements. And there was a dead silence, while they waited for the extraordinary disclosure. "It's as I thought," he said, with an amused expression. "The old chap had to quench his thirst somewhere; and, as there was only the spring—" "Oh, but look here," growled Farmer Goussot, "we should have seen him." "It was at night." "We should have heard him. And seen him too, as we were close by." "So was he." "And he drank the water from the pool?" "Yes." "How?" "From a little way off." "With what?" "With this." And the stranger showed the straw which he had picked up. "There, here's the straw for the customer's long drink. You will see there's more of it than usual. In fact, it is made of 3 straws stuck into one another. That was the first thing I noticed: those 3 straws fastened together. The proof is conclusive." "But, hang it all, the proof of what?" cried Farmer Goussot irritably. The stranger took a shotgun from the rack. "Is it loaded?" he asked. "Yes," said the youngest of the brothers. "I use it to kill the sparrows with, for fun. It's small shot." "Capital! A peppering where it won't hurt him will do the trick." His face suddenly assumed a masterful look. He gripped the farmer by the arm and rapped out, in an imperious tone: "Listen to me, Farmer Goussot. I'm not here to do policeman's work, and I won't have the poor beggar locked up at any price. 4 weeks of starvation and fright is good enough for anybody. So you've got to swear to me, you and your sons, that you'll let him off without hurting him." "He must hand over the money." "Well, of course. Do you swear?" "I swear." The gentleman walked back to the door-sill, at the entrance to the orchard. He took a quick aim, pointing his gun a little in the air, in the direction of the cherry tree which overhung the spring. He fired. A hoarse cry rang from the tree, and the scarecrow, which had been straddling the main branch for a month past, came tumbling to the ground, only to jump up at once and make off as fast as its legs could carry it. There was a moment's amazement, followed by outcries. The sons darted in pursuit and were not long in coming up with the runaway, hampered as he was by his rags and weakened by privation. But the stranger was already protecting him against their wrath. "Hands off there! This man belongs to me. I won't have him touched. I hope I haven't stung you up too much, Trainard." Standing on his straw legs wrapped round with strips of tattered cloth, with his arms and his whole body clad in the same materials, his head swathed in linen, tightly packed like a sausage, the old chap still had the stiff appearance of a lay figure. And the whole effect was so ludicrous and so unexpected that the onlookers screamed with laughter. The stranger unbound his head; and they saw a veiled mask of tangled grey beard encroaching on every side upon a skeleton face lit up by two eyes burning with fever. The laughter was louder than ever. "The money! The 6 notes!" roared the farmer. The stranger kept him at a distance. "One moment. We'll give you that back, shan't we, Trainard?" And, taking his knife and cutting away the straw and cloth, he jested cheerily: "You poor old beggar, what a guy you look! But how on earth did you manage to pull off that trick? You must be confoundedly clever, or else you had the devil's own luck. So, on the first night, you used the breathing time they left you to rig yourself in these togs. Not a bad idea. Who could ever suspect a scarecrow? They were so accustomed to seeing it stuck up in its tree. But, poor old daddy, how uncomfortable you must have felt, lying flat up there on your stomach, with your arms and legs dangling down. All day long like that. The deuce of an attitude! And how you must have been put to it, when you ventured to move a limb, eh? And how you must have funked going to sleep! And then you had to eat and drink, and you heard the sentry and felt the barrel of his gun within a yard of your nose. Brrr! But the trickiest of all, you know, was your bit of straw. Upon my word, when I think that, without a sound, without a movement, so to speak, you had to fish out lengths of straw from your toggery, fix them end to end, let your apparatus down to the water and suck up the heavenly moisture drop by drop. Upon my word, one could scream with admiration. Well done, Trainard. And he added, between his teeth, only you're in a very unappetizing state, my man. Haven't you washed yourself all this month, you old pig? After all, you had as much water as you wanted. Here, you people, I hand him over to you. I'm going to wash my hands. That's what I'm going to do." Farmer Goussot and his 4 sons grabbed at the prey which he was abandoning to them. "Now then, come along, fork out the money." Dazed as he was, the tramp still managed to simulate astonishment. "Don't put on that idiotic look," growled the farmer. "Come on, out with the 6 notes." What do you want of me?" stammered old Trainard. "The money, on the nail." "What money?" "The bank notes." "Bank notes? Oh, I'm getting sick of you. Here, lads." They laid the old fellow flat, tore off the rags that composed his clothes, felt and searched him all over. There was nothing on him. "You thief and you robber!" yelled old Goussot. "What have you done with it?" The old beggar seemed more dazed than ever. Too cunning to confess, he kept on whining: "What do you want of me? Money? I haven't 3 sous to call my own." But his eyes, wide with wonder, remained fixed upon his clothes, and he himself seemed not to understand. The Goussots' rage could no longer be restrained. They rained blows upon him, which did not improve matters. But the farmer was convinced that Trainard had hidden the money before turning himself into the scarecrow. "Where have you put it, you scum? Out with it! In what part of the orchard have you hidden it?" "The money?" repeated the tramp with a stupid look. "Yes, the money which you buried somewhere. Oh, if we don't find it, your goose is cooked. We have witnesses, haven't we? All of you friends, eh? And then the gentleman." He turned, with the intention of addressing the stranger, in the direction of the spring, which was 30 or 40 steps to the left. And he was quite surprised not to see him washing his hands there. "Has he gone?" he asked. Some one answered: "No, he lit a cigarette and went for a stroll in the orchard." "Oh, that's all right," said the farmer. "He's the sort to find the notes for us, just as he's found the man." "Unless," said a voice. "Unless what?" echoed the farmer. "What do you mean? Have you something in your head? Out with it, then. What is it?" But he interrupted himself suddenly, seized with a doubt. And there was a moment's silence. The same idea dawned on all the country folk. The stranger's arrival at Héberville, the breakdown of his motor, his manner of questioning the people at the inn and of gaining admission to the farm: were not all these part and parcel of a put up job, the trick of a cracksman who had learned the story from the papers and who had come to try his luck on the spot? "Jolly smart of him," said the inn keeper. "He must have taken the money from old Trainard's pocket, before our eyes, while he was searching him." "Impossible!" spluttered Farmer Goussot. "He would have been seen going out that way, by the house, whereas he's strolling in the orchard." Mother Goussot, all of a heap, suggested: "The little door at the end, down there." "The key never leaves me." "But you showed it to him." "Yes, and I took it back again. Look, here it is." He clapped his hand to his pocket and uttered a cry: "Oh, dash it all, it's gone! He sneaked it!" He at once rushed away, followed and escorted by his sons and a number of the villagers. When they were half way down the orchard, they heard the throb of a motor car, obviously the one belonging to the stranger, who had given orders to his chauffeur to wait for him at that lower entrance. When the Goussots reached the door, they saw scrawled with a brick, on the worm-eaten panel, the two words: "Arsène Lupin." Stick to it as the angry Goussots might, they found it impossible to prove that old Trainard had stolen any money. 20 persons had to bear witness that, when all was said, nothing was discovered on his person. He escaped with a few months' imprisonment for the assault. He did not regret them. As soon as he was released, he was secretly informed that every quarter, on a given date, at a given hour, under a given milestone, on a given road, he would find 3 gold louis. To a man like old Trainard, that means wealth. Chapter 10 Part I of The Confessions of Arsène Lupin. This LibriVox is in the public domain. The Confessions of Arsène Lupin, by Maurice LeBlanc. Chapter 10: Edith Swan Neck. "Arsène Lupin, what's your real opinion of Inspector Ganimard?" "A very high one, my dear fellow." "A very high one? Then why do you never miss a chance of turning him into ridicule?" "It's a bad habit; and I'm sorry for it. But what can I say? It's the way of the world. Here's a decent detective chap, here's a whole pack of decent men, who stand for law and order, who protect us against the Apaches, who risk their lives for honest people like you and me, and we have nothing to give them in return but flouts and gibes. It's preposterous." "Bravo, Lupin! You're talking like a respectable ratepayer." "What else am I? I may have peculiar views about other people's property, but I assure you that it's very different when my own's at stake. By Jove, it doesn't do to lay hands on what belongs to me. Then I'm out for blood. Ah, it's my pocket, my money, my watch. Hands off! I have the soul of a conservative, my dear fellow, the instincts of a retired tradesman, and a due respect for every sort of tradition and authority. And that is why Ganimard inspires me with no little gratitude and esteem." "But not much admiration?" "Plenty of admiration too. Over and above the dauntless courage which comes natural to all those gentry at the Criminal Investigation Department, Ganimard possesses very sterling qualities: decision, insight and judgment. I have watched him at work. He's somebody, when all's said. Do you know the Edith Swan Neck story, as it was called?" "I know as much as everybody knows." "That means that you don't know it at all. Well, that job was, I daresay, the one which I thought out most cleverly, with the utmost care and the utmost precaution, the one which I shrouded in the greatest darkness and mystery, the one which it took the biggest generalship to carry through. It was a regular game of chess, played according to strict scientific and mathematical rules. And yet Ganimard ended by unravelling the knot. Thanks to him, they know the truth to day on the Quai des Orfèvres. And it is a truth quite out of the common, I assure you." "May I hope to hear it?" "Certainly, one of these days, when I have time. But the Brunelli is dancing at the opera to night, and if she were not to see me in my stall...." I do not meet Lupin often. He confesses with difficulty, when it suits him. It was only gradually, by snatches, by odds and ends of confidences, that I was able to obtain the different incidents and to piece the story together in all its details. The main features are well known and I will merely mention the facts. 3 years ago, when the train from Brest arrived at Rennes, the door of one of the luggage vans was found smashed in. This van had been booked by Colonel Sparmiento, a rich Brazilian, who was travelling with his wife in the same train. It contained a complete set of tapestry hangings. The case in which one of these was packed had been broken open and the tapestry had disappeared. Colonel Sparmiento started proceedings against the railway company, claiming heavy damages, not only for the stolen tapestry, but also for the loss in value which the whole collection suffered in consequence of the theft. The police instituted inquiries. The company offered a large reward. A fortnight later, a letter which had come undone in the post was opened by the authorities and revealed the fact that the theft had been carried out under the direction of Arsène Lupin, and that a package was to leave next day for the United States. That same evening, the tapestry was discovered in a trunk deposited in the cloakroom at the Gare Saint-Lazare. The scheme, therefore, had miscarried. Lupin felt the disappointment so much that he vented his ill humour in a communication to Colonel Sparmiento, ending with the following words, which were clear enough for anybody: "It was very considerate of me to take only one. Next time, I shall take the 12. Verbum sap." Colonel Sparmiento had been living for some months in a house standing at the end of a small garden, at the corner of the Rue de la Fessandrie and the Rue du Fresnoy. He was a rather thick-set, broad-shouldered man, with black hair and a swarthy skin, always well and quietly dressed. He was married to an extremely pretty but delicate Englishwoman, who was much upset by the business of the tapestries. From the first she implored her husband to sell them for what they would fetch. The colonel had much too forcible and dogged a nature to yield to what he had every right to describe as a woman's fancies. He sold nothing, but he redoubled his precautions and adopted every measure that was likely to make an attempt at burglary impossible. To begin with, so that he might confine his watch to the garden front, he walled up all the windows on the ground floor and the first floor overlooking the Rue du Fresnoy. Next, he enlisted the services of a firm which made a speciality of protecting private houses against robberies. Every window of the gallery in which the tapestries were hung was fitted with invisible burglar alarms, the position of which was known to none but himself. These, at the least touch, switched on all the electric lights and set a whole system of bells and gongs ringing. In addition to this, the insurance companies to which he applied refused to grant policies to any considerable amount unless he consented to let 3 men, supplied by the companies and paid by himself, occupy the ground floor of his house every night. They selected for the purpose 3 ex-detectives, tried and trustworthy men, all of whom hated Lupin like poison. As for the servants, the colonel had known them for years and was ready to vouch for them. After taking these steps and organizing the defence of the house as though it were a fortress, the colonel gave a great house-warming, a sort of private view, to which he invited the members of both his clubs, as well as a certain number of ladies, journalists, art patrons and critics. They felt, as they passed through the garden gate, much as if they were walking into a prison. The 3 private detectives, posted at the foot of the stairs, asked for each visitor's invitation card and eyed him up and down suspiciously, making him feel as though they were going to search his pockets or take his finger-prints. The colonel, who received his guests on the first floor, made laughing apologies and seemed delighted at the opportunity of explaining the arrangements which he had invented to secure the safety of his hangings. His wife stood by him, looking charmingly young and pretty, fair-haired, pale and sinuous, with a sad and gentle expression, the expression of resignation often worn by those who are threatened by fate. When all the guests had come, the garden gates and the hall doors were closed. Then everybody filed into the middle gallery, which was reached through 2 steel doors, while its windows, with their huge shutters, were protected by iron bars. This was where the 12 tapestries were kept. They were matchless works of art, and taking their inspiration from the famous Bayeux tapestry, attributed to Queen Matilda, they represented the story of the Norman Conquest. They had been ordered in the 14th century by the descendant of a man-at-arms in William the Conqueror's train, were executed by Jehan Gosset, a famous Arras weaver, and were discovered 500 years later in an old Breton manor-house. On hearing of this, the colonel had struck a bargain for 50,000 francs. They were worth 10 times the money. But the finest of the 12 hangings composing the set, the most uncommon because the subject had not been treated by Queen Matilda, was the one which Arsène Lupin had stolen, and which had been so fortunately recovered. It portrayed Edith Swan neck on the battlefield of Hastings, seeking among the dead for the body of her sweetheart Harold, last of the Saxon kings. The guests were lost in enthusiasm over this tapestry, over the unsophisticated beauty of the design, over the faded colours, over the lifelike grouping of the figures and the pitiful sadness of the scene. Poor Edith Swan neck stood drooping like an overweighted lily. Her white gown revealed the lines of her languid figure. Her long tapering hands were outstretched in a gesture of terror and entreaty. And nothing could be more mournful than her profile, over which flickered the most dejected and despairing of smiles. "A harrowing smile," remarked one of the critics, to whom the others listened with deference. "A very charming smile besides. And it reminds me, Colonel, of the smile of Madame Sparmiento." And seeing that the observation seemed to meet with approval, he enlarged upon his idea. "There are other points of resemblance that struck me at once, such as the very graceful curve of the neck and the delicacy of the hands, and also something about the figure, about the general attitude." "What you say is so true," said the colonel, "that I confess that it was this likeness that decided me to buy the hangings. And there was another reason, which was that, by a really curious chance, my wife's name happens to be Edith. I have called her Edith Swan neck ever since." And the colonel added, with a laugh, "I hope that the coincidence will stop at this, and that my dear Edith will never have to go in search of her true love's body, like her prototype." He laughed as he uttered these words, but his laugh met with no echo, and we find the same impression of awkward silence in all the accounts of the evening that appeared during the next few days. The people standing near him did not know what to say. One of them tried to jest. "Your name isn't Harold, Colonel?" "No, thank you," he declared, with continued merriment. "No, that's not my name, nor am I in the least like the Saxon king." All have since agreed in stating that, at that moment, as the colonel finished speaking, the first alarm rang from the windows. The right or the middle window, opinions differ on this point, rang short and shrill on a single note. The peal of the alarm bell was followed by an exclamation of terror uttered by Madame Sparmiento, who caught hold of her husband's arm. He cried: "What's the matter? What does this mean?" The guests stood motionless, with their eyes staring at the windows. The colonel repeated: "What does it mean? I don't understand. No one but myself knows where that bell is fixed." And at that moment, here again the evidence is unanimous, at that moment came sudden, absolute darkness, followed immediately by the maddening din of all the bells and all the gongs, from top to bottom of the house, in every room and at every window. For a few seconds, a stupid disorder, an insane terror reigned. The women screamed. The men banged with their fists on the closed doors. They hustled and fought. People fell to the floor and were trampled underfoot. It was like a panic-stricken crowd, scared by threatening flames or by a bursting shell. And above the uproar rose the colonel's voice, shouting: "Silence! Don't move! It's all right! The switch is over there, in the corner. Wait a bit. Here." He had pushed his way through his guests and reached a corner of the gallery; and all at once the electric light blazed up again, while the pandemonium of bells stopped. Then, in the sudden light, a strange sight met the eyes. Two ladies had fainted. Madame Sparmiento, hanging to her husband's arm, with her knees dragging on the floor, and livid in the face, appeared half dead. The men, pale, with their neckties awry, looked as if they had all been in the wars. "The tapestries are there!" cried some one. There was a great surprise, as though the disappearance of those hangings ought to have been the natural result and the only plausible explanation of the incident. But nothing had been moved. A few valuable pictures, hanging on the walls, were there still. And though the same din had reverberated all over the house, though all the rooms had been thrown into darkness, the detectives had seen no one entering or trying to enter. "Besides," said the colonel, "it's only the windows of the gallery that have alarms. Nobody but myself understands how they work, and I had not set them yet." People laughed loudly at the way in which they had been frightened, but they laughed without conviction and in a more or less shamefaced fashion, for each of them was keenly alive to the absurdity of his conduct. And they had but one thought: to get out of that house where, say what you would, the atmosphere was one of agonizing anxiety. Two journalists stayed behind, however, and the colonel joined them after attending to Edith and handing her over to her maids. The three of them, together with the detectives, made a search that did not lead to the discovery of anything of the least interest. Then the colonel sent for some champagne; and the result was that it was not until a late hour, to be exact, 2:45 in the morning, that the journalists took their leave, the colonel retired to his quarters, and the detectives withdrew to the room which had been set aside for them on the ground floor. They took the watch by turns, a watch consisting, in the first place, in keeping awake, and next, in looking round the garden and visiting the gallery at intervals. These orders were scrupulously carried out, except between 5 and 7 in the morning, when sleep gained the mastery and the men ceased to go their rounds. But it was broad daylight out of doors. Besides, if there had been the least sound of bells, would they not have woke up? Nevertheless, when one of them, at 20 minutes past 7, opened the door of the gallery and flung back the shutters, he saw that the 12 tapestries were gone. This man and the others were blamed afterward for not giving the alarm at once and for starting their own investigations before informing the colonel and telephoning to the local commissary. Yet this very excusable delay can hardly be said to have hampered the action of the police. In any case, the colonel was not told until 8:30. He was dressed and ready to go out. The news did not seem to upset him beyond measure, or at least he managed to control his emotion. But the effort must have been too much for him, for he suddenly dropped into a chair and, for some moments, gave way to a regular fit of despair and anguish, most painful to behold in a man of his resolute appearance. Recovering and mastering himself, he went to the gallery, stared at the bare walls and then sat down at a table and hastily scribbled a letter, which he put into an envelope and sealed. "There," he said, "I'm in a hurry. I have an important engagement. Here is a letter for the commissary of police." And seeing the detective's eyes upon him, he added, "I am giving the commissary my views, telling him of a suspicion that occurs to me. He must follow it up. I will do what I can." He left the house at a run, with excited gestures which the detectives were subsequently to remember. A few minutes later, the commissary of police arrived. He was handed the letter, which contained the following words: "I am at the end of my tether. The theft of those tapestries completes the crash which I have been trying to conceal for the past year. I bought them as a speculation and was hoping to get 1,000,000 francs for them, thanks to the fuss that was made about them. As it was, an American offered me 600,000. It meant my salvation. This means utter destruction. I hope that my dear wife will forgive the sorrow which I am bringing upon her. Her name will be on my lips at the last moment." Mme. Sparmiento was informed. She remained aghast with horror, while inquiries were instituted and attempts made to trace the colonel's movements. Late in the afternoon, a telephone message came from Ville d'Avray. A gang of railway men had found a man's body lying at the entrance to a tunnel after a train had passed. The body was hideously mutilated. The face had lost all resemblance to anything human. There were no papers in the pockets, but the description answered to that of the colonel. Mme. Sparmiento arrived at Ville d'Avray by motor car, at 7 o'clock in the evening. She was taken to a room at the railway station. When the sheet that covered it was removed, Edith Swan-Neck, recognized her husband's body. In these circumstances, Lupin did not receive his usual good notices in the press. "Let him look to himself," jeered one leader writer, summing up the general opinion. "It would not take many exploits of this kind for him to forfeit the popularity which has not been grudged him hitherto. We have no use for Lupin, except when his rogueries are perpetrated at the expense of shady company promoters, foreign adventurers, German barons, banks and financial companies. And, above all, no murders. A burglar we can put up with, but a murderer, no. If he is not directly guilty, he is at least responsible for this death. There is blood upon his hands. The arms on his escutcheon are stained jewels." The public anger and disgust were increased by the pity which Edith's pale face aroused. The guests of the night before gave their version of what had happened, omitting none of the impressive details; and a legend formed straightway around the fair-haired Englishwoman, a legend that assumed a really tragic character, owing to the popular story of the swan-necked heroine. And yet the public could not withhold its admiration of the extraordinary skill with which the theft had been effected. The police explained it after a fashion. The detectives had noticed from the first and subsequently stated that one of the 3 windows of the gallery was wide open. There could be no doubt that Lupin and his confederates had entered through this window. It seemed a very plausible suggestion. Still, in that case, how were they able, first, to climb the garden railings, in coming and going, without being seen? Secondly, to cross the garden and put up a ladder on the flower border, without leaving the least trace behind? Thirdly, to open the shutters in the window, without starting the bells and switching on the lights in the house? The police accused the 3 detectives of complicity. The magistrate in charge of the case examined them at length, made minute inquiries into their private lives and stated formally that they were above all suspicion. As for the tapestries, there seemed to be no hope that they would be recovered. It was at this moment that Chief Inspector Ganimard returned from India, where he had been hunting for Lupin on the strength of a number of most convincing proofs supplied by former confederates of Lupin himself. Feeling that he had once more been tricked by his everlasting adversary, fully believing that Lupin had dispatched him on this wild goose chase so as to be rid of him during the business of the tapestries, he asked for a fortnight's leave of absence, called on Mme. Sparmiento and promised to avenge her husband. Edith had reached the point at which not even the thought of vengeance relieves the sufferer's pain. She had dismissed the 3 detectives on the day of the funeral and engaged just one man and an old cook housekeeper to take the place of the large staff of servants, the sight of whom reminded her too cruelly of the past. Not caring what happened, she kept her room and left Ganimard free to act as he pleased. He took up his quarters on the ground floor and at once instituted a series of the most minute investigations. He started the inquiry afresh, questioned the people in the neighbourhood, studied the distribution of the rooms and set each of the burglar alarms going 30 and 40 times over. At the end of the fortnight, he asked for an extension of leave. The chief of the detective service, who was at that time M. Dudouis, came to see him and found him perched on the top of a ladder, in the gallery. That day, the chief inspector admitted that all his searches had proved useless. 2 days later, however, M. Dudouis called again and discovered Ganimard in a very thoughtful frame of mind. A bundle of newspapers lay spread in front of him. At last, in reply to his superior's urgent questions, the chief inspector muttered: "I know nothing, chief, absolutely nothing. But there's a confounded notion worrying me. Only it seems so absurd. And then it doesn't explain things. On the contrary, it confuses them rather." "Then?" "Then I implore you, chief, to have a little patience, to let me go my own way. But if I telephone to you, some day or other, suddenly, you must jump into a taxi, without losing a minute. It will mean that I have discovered the secret." 48 hours passed. Then, one morning, M. Dudouis received a telegram: "Going to Lille. Ganimard." Chapter 10, Part 2 of The Confessions of Arsène Lupin. This recording is in the public domain. The Confessions of Arsène Lupin, by Maurice LeBlanc. Chapter 10. Edith Swan neck. "What the dickens can he want to go to Lille for?" wondered the chief detective. The day passed without news, followed by another day. But M. Dudouis had every confidence in Ganimard. He knew his man, knew that the old detective was not one of those people who excite themselves for nothing. When Ganimard got a move on him, it meant that he had sound reasons for doing so. As a matter of fact, on the evening of that second day, M. Dudouis was called to the telephone. "Is that you, chief?" "Is it Ganimard speaking?" Cautious men both, they began by making sure of each other's identity. As soon as his mind was eased on this point, Ganimard continued, hurriedly: "10 men, chief, at once. And please come yourself." "Where are you?" "In the house, on the ground floor. But I will wait for you just inside the garden gate." "I'll come at once. In a taxi, of course?" "Yes, chief. Stop the taxi 50 yards from the house. I'll let you in when you whistle." Things took place as Ganimard had arranged. Shortly after midnight, when all the lights were out on the upper floors, he slipped into the street and went to meet M. Dudouis. There was a hurried consultation. The officers distributed themselves as Ganimard ordered. Then the chief and the chief inspector walked back together, noiselessly crossed the garden and closeted themselves with every precaution. "Well, what's it all about?" asked M. Dudouis. "What does all this mean? Upon my word, we look like a pair of conspirators." But Ganimard was not laughing. His chief had never seen him in such a state of perturbation, nor heard him speak in a voice denoting such excitement. "Any news, Ganimard?" "Yes, chief, and this time...." But I can hardly believe it myself. And yet I'm not mistaken. I know the real truth. It may be as unlikely as you please, but it is the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth." He wiped away the drops of perspiration that trickled down his forehead and, after a further question from M. Dudouis, pulled himself together, swallowed a glass of water and began: "Lupin has often got the better of me." "Look here, Ganimard," said M. Dudouis, interrupting him, "why can't you come straight to the point? Tell me in 2 words what's happened." "No, chief," retorted the chief inspector. "It is essential that you should know the different stages which I have passed through. Excuse me, but I consider it indispensable." And he repeated: "I was saying, chief, that Lupin has often got the better of me and led me many a dance. But, in this contest in which I have always come out worst, so far, I have at least gained experience of his manner of play and learnt to know his tactics. Now, in the matter of the tapestries, it occurred to me almost from the start to set myself two problems. In the first place, Lupin, who never makes a move without knowing what he is after, was obviously aware that Colonel Sparmiento had come to the end of his money and that the loss of the tapestries might drive him to suicide. Nevertheless, Lupin, who hates the very thought of bloodshed, stole the tapestries. "There was the inducement," said M. Dudouis, "of the 500,000 or 600,000 francs which they are worth." "No, chief, I tell you once more, whatever the occasion might be, Lupin would not take life, nor be the cause of another person's death, for anything in this world, for millions and millions. That's the first point. In the second place, what was the object of all that disturbance, in the evening, during the house-warming party? Obviously, don't you think, to surround the business with an atmosphere of anxiety and terror, in the shortest possible time, and also to divert suspicion from the truth, which otherwise might easily have been suspected." "You seem not to understand, chief." "Upon my word, I do not." "As a matter of fact," said Ganimard, "as a matter of fact, it is not particularly plain. And I myself, when I put the problem before my mind in those same words, did not understand it very clearly. And yet I felt that I was on the right track. Yes, there was no doubt about it that Lupin wanted to divert suspicions. And to divert them to himself, Lupin, mark you, so that the real person who was working the business might remain unknown." "A confederate," suggested M. Dudouis. "A confederate, moving among the visitors, who set the alarms going, and who managed to hide in the house after the party had broken up." "You're getting warm, chief, you're getting warm. It is certain that the tapestries, as they cannot have been stolen by any one making his way surreptitiously into the house, were stolen by somebody who remained in the house, and it is equally certain that, by taking the list of the people invited and inquiring into the antecedents of each of them, one might—" "Well?" "Well, chief, there's a but. Namely, that the three detectives had this list in their hands when the guests arrived and that they still had it when the guests left. Now 63 came in and 63 went away. So you see—" "Then you suppose a servant?" "No." "The detectives?" "No." But still," said the chief impatiently, "if the robbery was committed from the inside—" "That is beyond dispute," declared the inspector, whose excitement seemed to be nearing fever point. "There is no question about it. All my investigations led to the same certainty; and my conviction gradually became so positive that I ended one day by drawing up this startling axiom: in theory and in fact, the robbery can only have been committed with the assistance of an accomplice staying in the house, whereas there was no accomplice." "That's absurd," said Dudouis. "Quite absurd," said Ganimard. "But at the very moment when I uttered that absurd sentence, the truth flashed upon me." "Eh?" "Oh, a very dim, very incomplete, but still sufficient truth. With that clue to guide me, I was bound to find the way. Do you follow me, chief?" M. Dudouis sat silent. The same phenomenon that had taken place in Ganimard was evidently taking place in him. He muttered: "If it's not one of the guests, nor the servants, nor the private detectives, then there's no one left." "Yes, chief, there's one left." M. Dudouis started as though he had received a shock; and, in a voice that betrayed his excitement: "But, look here, that's preposterous!" "Why?" "Come, think for yourself." "Go on, chief, say what's in your mind." "Nonsense! What do you mean?" "Go on, chief." "It's impossible! How can Sparmiento have been Lupin's accomplice?" Ganimard gave a little chuckle: "Exactly, Arsène Lupin's accomplice. That explains everything. During the night, while the three detectives were downstairs watching, or sleeping rather, for Colonel Sparmiento had given them champagne to drink and perhaps doctored it beforehand, the said colonel took down the hangings and passed them out through the window of his bedroom. The room is on the second floor and looks out on another street, which was not watched, because the lower windows are walled up." M. Dudouis reflected and then shrugged his shoulders: "It's preposterous!" he repeated. "Why?" "Why? Because if the colonel had been Arsène Lupin's accomplice, he would not have committed suicide after achieving his success." "Who says that he committed suicide?" Why, he was found dead on the line!" "I told you there is no such thing as death with Lupin." "Still, this was genuine enough. Besides, Mme. Sparmiento identified the body." "I thought you would say that, chief. The argument worried me too. There was I, all of a sudden, with three people in front of me instead of one: first, Arsène Lupin, cracksman; secondly, Colonel Sparmiento, his accomplice; thirdly, a dead man. Spare us! It was too much of a good thing." Ganimard took a bundle of newspapers, untied it and handed one of them to Mr. Dudouis. "You remember, chief, last time you were here, I was looking through the papers. I wanted to see if something had not happened, at that period, that might bear upon the case and confirm my supposition. Please read this paragraph." M. Dudouis took the paper and read aloud: "Our little correspondent informs us that a curious incident has occurred in that town. A corpse has disappeared from the local morgue, the corpse of a man unknown who threw himself under the wheels of a steam tramcar on the day before. No one is able to suggest a reason for this disappearance." M. Dudouis sat thinking and then asked: "So you believe...." "I have just come from Lille," replied Ganimard, "and my inquiries leave not a doubt in my mind. The corpse was removed on the same night on which Colonel Sparmiento gave his house warming. It was taken straight to Ville d'Avray by motor car; and the car remained near the railway line until the evening." "Near the tunnel, therefore," said M. Dudouis. "Next to it, chief." "So that the body which was found is merely that body, dressed in Colonel Sparmiento's clothes?" "Precisely, chief." "Then Colonel Sparmiento is not dead?" "No more dead than you or I, chief." "But then why all these complications? Why the theft of one tapestry, followed by its discovery, followed by the theft of the 12? Why that house warming? Why that disturbance? Why everything? Your story won't hold water, Ganimard." "Only because you, chief, like myself, have stopped half way. Because, strange as this story already sounds, we must go still farther, very much farther, in the direction of the improbable and the astounding. And why not, after all? Remember that we are dealing with Arsène Lupin. With him is it not always just the improbable and the astounding that we must look for? Must we not always go straight for the maddest suppositions? And when I say the maddest, I am using the wrong word. On the contrary, the whole thing is wonderfully logical and so simple that a child could understand it. Confederates only betray you. Why employ confederates, when it is so easy and so natural to act for yourself, by yourself, with your own hands and by the means within your own reach?" "What are you saying? What are you saying? What are you saying?" cried M. Dudouis, in a sort of sing-song voice and a tone of bewilderment that increased with each separate exclamation. Ganimard gave a fresh chuckle: "Takes your breath away, chief, doesn't it? So it did mine, on the day when you came to see me here and when the notion was beginning to grow upon me. I was flabbergasted with astonishment. And yet I've had experience of my customer. I know what he's capable of. But this, no, this was really a bit too stiff." "It's impossible, it's impossible," said M. Dudouis, in a low voice. "On the contrary, chief, it's quite possible and quite logical and quite normal. It's the threefold incarnation of one and the same individual. A schoolboy would solve the problem in a minute, by a simple process of elimination. Take away the dead man, there remain Sparmiento and Lupin. Take away Sparmiento, there remains Lupin," muttered the chief detective. "Yes, chief, Lupin simply, Lupin in 5 letters and 2 syllables, Lupin taken out of his Brazilian skin, Lupin revived from the dead, Lupin translated, for the past 6 months, into Colonel Sparmiento, travelling in Brittany, hearing of the discovery of the 12 tapestries, buying them, planning the theft of the best of them, so as to draw attention to himself, Lupin, and divert it from himself, Sparmiento. Next, he brings about, in full view of the gaping public, a noisy contest between Lupin and Sparmiento, or Sparmiento and Lupin, plots and gives the house-warming party, terrifies his guests and, when everything is ready, arranges for Lupin to steal Sparmiento's tapestries and for Sparmiento, Lupin's victim, to disappear from sight and die unsuspected, unsuspectable, regretted by his friends, pitied by the public, and leaving behind him, to pocket the profits of the swindle." Ganimard stopped, looked at the chief in the eyes and, in a voice that emphasized the importance of his words, concluded: leaving behind him a disconsolate widow.
Mme. Sparmiento? You really believe?
Hang it all, said the chief inspector. People don't work up a whole business of this sort without seeing something ahead of them, solid profits. But the profits, it seems to me, lie in the sale of the tapestries which Lupin will effect in America or elsewhere. First of all, yes, but Colonel Sparmiento could effect that sale just as well, and even better. So there's something more. Something more? Come, chief, you're forgetting that Colonel Sparmiento has been the victim of an important robbery and that though he may be dead, at least his widow remains. So it's his widow who will get the money. What money? What money? Why, the money due to her. The insurance money, of course. M. Dudouis was staggered. The whole business suddenly became clear to him, with its real meaning. He muttered: "That's true. That's true. The colonel had insured his tapestries." "Rather, and for no trifle either." "For how much?" 800,000 francs. 800,000? Just so. In 5 different companies." "And has Mme. Sparmiento had the money?" "She got 150,000 francs yesterday and 200,000 to day, while I was away. The remaining payments are to be made in the course of this week." "But this is terrible! You ought to have—" "What, chief? To begin with, they took advantage of my absence to settle up accounts with the companies. I only heard about it on my return, when I ran up against an insurance manager whom I happened to know and took the opportunity of drawing him out." The chief detective was silent for some time, not knowing what to say. Then he mumbled: "What a fellow, though!" Ganimard nodded his head: "Yes, chief, a blackguard, but I can't help saying, a devil of a clever fellow. For his plan to succeed, he must have managed it in such a way that, for 4 or 5 weeks, no one could express or even conceive the least suspicion of the part played by Colonel Sparmiento. All the indignation and all the inquiries had to be concentrated upon Lupin alone. In the last resort, people had to find themselves faced simply with a mournful, pitiful, penniless widow, poor Edith Swan-neck, a beautiful and legendary vision, a creature so pathetic that the gentlemen of the insurance companies were almost glad to place something in her hands to relieve her poverty and her grief. That's what was wanted and that's what happened." The 2 men were close together and did not take their eyes from each other's faces. The chief asked: "Who is that woman?" "Sonia Kritchnoff." "Sonia Kritchnoff?" "Yes, the Russian girl whom I arrested last year at the time of the theft of the coronet and whom Lupin helped to escape." "Are you sure?" "Absolutely. I was put off the scent like everybody else by Lupin's machinations and had paid no particular attention to her. But when I knew the part which she was playing, I remembered. She is certainly Sonia, metamorphosed into an Englishwoman. Sonia, the most innocent looking and the trickiest of actresses. Sonia, who would not hesitate to face death for love of Lupin." "A good capture, Ganimard," said Dudouis, approvingly. "I've something better still for you, chief." "Really? What?" "Lupin's old foster mother." "Victoire?" "She has been here since Mme. Sparmiento began playing the widow. She's the cook." "Oh!" said M. Dudouis. "My congratulations, Ganimard." "I've something for you, chief, that's even better than that." M. Dudouis gave a start. The inspector's hand clutched his and was shaking with excitement. "What do you mean, Ganimard?" "Do you think, chief, that I would have brought you here, at this late hour, if I had had nothing more attractive to offer you than Sonia and Victoire? Pah, they'd have kept." "You mean to say?" whispered M. Dudouis, at last, understanding the chief inspector's agitation. "You've guessed it, chief." "Is he here?" "He's here." "In hiding?" "Not a bit of it. Simply in disguise. He's the manservant." This time, M. Dudouis did not utter a word nor make a gesture. Lupin's audacity confounded him. Ganimard chuckled: "It's no longer a threefold, but a fourfold incarnation. Edith Swan-neck might have blundered. The master's presence was necessary; and he had the cheek to return. For 3 weeks he has been beside me during my inquiry, calmly following the progress made." "Did you recognize him?" "One doesn't recognize him. He has a knack of making up his face and altering the proportions of his body so as to prevent any one from knowing him. Besides, I was miles from suspecting. But this evening, as I was watching Sonia in the shadow of the stairs, I heard Victoire speak to the manservant and call him 'dearie.' A light flashed in upon me. 'Dearie,' that was what she always used to call him. And I knew where I was. M. Dudouis seemed flustered, in his turn, by the presence of the enemy, so often pursued and always so intangible. "We've got him this time," he said, between his teeth. "We've got him, and he can't escape us." "No, chief, he can't. Neither he nor the two women." "Where are they?" "Sonia and Victoire are on the second floor. Lupin is on the third." M. Dudouis suddenly became anxious. "Why, it was through the windows of one of those floors that the tapestries were passed when they disappeared." "That's so, chief." "In that case, Lupin can get away too. The windows look out on the Rue Dufresnoy." "Of course they do, chief, but I have taken my precautions. The moment you arrived, I sent 4 of our men to keep watch under the windows in the Rue Dufresnoy. They have strict instructions to shoot, if any one appears at the windows and looks like coming down. Blank cartridges for the first shot, ball cartridges for the next." "Good, Ganimard. You have thought of everything. We'll wait here. And immediately after sunrise?" "Wait, chief? Stand on ceremony with that rascal? Bother about rules and regulations, legal hours and all that rot? And suppose he's not quite so polite to us and gives us the slip meanwhile? Suppose he plays us one of his Lupin tricks? No, no, we must have no nonsense. We've got him, let's collar him, and that without delay." And Ganimard, all a-quiver with indignant impatience, went out, walked across the garden and presently returned with half a dozen men. "It's all right, chief. I've told them, in the Rue Dufresnoy, to get their revolvers out and aim at the windows. Come along." These alarms and excursions had not been effected without a certain amount of noise, which was bound to be heard by the inhabitants of the house. M. Dudouis felt that his hand was forced. He made up his mind to act. "Come on, then," he said. The thing did not take long. The 8 of them, Browning pistols in hand, went up the stairs without overmuch precaution, eager to surprise Lupin before he had time to organize his defences. "Open the door!" roared Ganimard, rushing at the door of Mme. Sparmiento's bedroom. A policeman smashed it in with his shoulder. There was no one in the room, and no one in Victoire's bedroom either. "They're all upstairs!" shouted Ganimard. "They've gone up to Lupin in his attic. Be careful now." All the 8 ran up the 3rd flight of stairs. To his great astonishment, Ganimard found the door of the attic open and the attic empty. And the other rooms were empty too. "Blast them!" he cursed. "What's become of them?" But the chief called him. M. Dudouis, who had gone down again to the 2nd floor, noticed that one of the windows was not latched, but just pushed to. "There," he said to Ganimard, "that's the road they took, the road of the tapestries. I told you as much: the Rue Dufresnoy." "But our men would have fired on them," protested Ganimard, grinding his teeth with rage. "The street's guarded." "They must have gone before the street was guarded." "They were all 3 of them in their rooms when I rang you up, chief." "They must have gone while you were waiting for me in the garden." "But why? Why? There was no reason why they should go to day rather than to morrow, or the next day, or next week, for that matter, when they had pocketed all the insurance money." Yes, there was a reason; and Ganimard knew it when he saw, on the table, a letter addressed to him, and opened it and read it. The letter was worded in the style of the testimonials which we hand to people in our service who have given satisfaction. "I, the undersigned, Arsène Lupin, gentleman burglar, ex-colonel, ex-man of all work, ex-corpse, hereby certify that the person of the name of Ganimard gave proof of the most remarkable qualities during his stay in this house. He was exemplary in his behaviour, thoroughly devoted and attentive, and, unaided by the least clue, he foiled a part of my plans and saved the insurance company's 450,000 francs. I congratulate him, and I am quite willing to overlook his blunder in not anticipating that the downstairs telephone communicates with the telephone in Sonia Kritchnoff's bedroom, and that when telephoning to Mr. Chief Detective, he was at the same time telephoning to me to clear out as fast as I could. It was a pardonable slip, which must not be allowed to dim the glamour of his services nor to detract from the merits of his victory. Having said this, I beg him to accept the homage of my admiration and of my sincere friendship. End of Chapter 10. End of The Confessions of Arsène Lupin, by Maurice LeBlanc. Recording by Kathy Barrett.